Here's to my older stepsister Claire. Brittany purred into the microphone. Her custom silk gown glittered under the massive crystal chandeliers of the Ritz Carlton ballroom. Still single at 35, still driving that tragic decade-old Honda, and still living in an apartment the exact size of my new walk-in closet. A chorus of laughter erupted from the 200 wealthy guests seated at the tables around me. I watched my biological mother Diane chuckle softly, raising her champagne flute to clink glasses with my wealthy stepdad Thomas. They looked so incredibly proud of their golden child. Brittany soaked in the attention, her eyes locking onto mine with a familiar predatory gleam. She stepped off the elevated stage and strutted over to my table, the heavy silk of her dress dragging across the polished marble floor. She stopped right beside my chair. A cruel, calculated smirk played on her lips as she reached into her diamond-encrusted clutch. She pulled out a crumpled $100 bill and tossed it onto my empty bread plate. The green paper sat stark against the pristine white porcelain. "Buy yourself a decent dress next time, Claire," she announced loudly, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable. "You are embarrassing Jamal and his entire family." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I just sat there in my modest navy blue dress, staring down at that crumpled bill. My face remained a mask of complete indifference. I did not scream or flip the table, because I knew something nobody else in this lavish flower-covered room knew. As a senior forensic accountant, I had spent the last 3 months quietly auditing my stepdad Thomas and his logistics company. I knew exactly whose money bought that silk gown, whose money paid for this opulent ballroom, and whose money was currently funding my stepsister's delusions of grandeur. I was sitting on a mountain of unredacted federal evidence, and the very man they were trying to defraud was sitting just 3 tables away, watching my every move. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Have you ever been the scapegoat of your toxic family and had to sit through their public humiliations? Hit like and subscribe, because the karma that hit this ballroom is something you will not want to miss. 24 hours earlier, I had arrived at the hotel, carrying my own luggage through the gold-plated revolving doors. I was exhausted from a long flight from Chicago, looking forward to the deluxe corner suite I had booked and paid for 3 months in advance. The reservation was my one indulgence for this agonizing family weekend. I walked up to the mahogany front desk and handed the concierge my credit card. "I am sorry, miss," the concierge said, his brow furrowing as he typed on his keyboard. "It appears your mother Diane transferred your suite reservation to the bridal makeup team this morning. She left instructions for you to be placed in the overflow quarters." Before I could even process the audacity of her changing a reservation in my name, I felt a sharp tap on my shoulder. I turned around to find my mother standing there, her arms crossed, wearing a designer pantsuit that cost more than my first car. "Do not make a scene, Claire," my mother hissed, pulling me away from the desk. "Brittany needs that natural light for her wedding photos. You are single and alone. You do not need a massive suite all to yourself. Do not be selfish on your sister's big weekend. Take the smaller room and be a team player for once in your life." She shoved a plastic keycard into my hand. I looked down at the room number. It was a tiny converted staff room located directly next to the noisy service elevator. I took a deep breath, swallowing the familiar bitter taste of being pushed aside. I took the keycard without arguing, dragging my suitcase toward the back hallways, but the humiliation did not stop there. Before I could even unlock my cramped room, my stepdad Thomas intercepted me in the narrow corridor. He did not ask about my flight or offer a hug. Instead, he shoved a folded piece of paper against my chest. "Take care of the florist, will you, Claire?" he said briskly, already turning to walk away. "It is $5,000. My corporate accounts are temporarily tied up in the upcoming merger, and the vendor is threatening to pull the centerpieces." I unfolded the invoice, staring at the massive balance. Thomas was a millionaire logistics CEO, yet here he was, extorting his stepdaughter in a hotel hallway. I paid the invoice quietly through my banking app. But as the confirmation screen popped up, I did not just save the receipt. I took a high-resolution photograph of the invoice directly linking it to Thomas and his supposedly tied-up corporate account numbers. He thought he was using me. He had no idea he had just handed a forensic auditor the final piece of evidence needed to destroy his entire empire. I slipped my phone back into my purse just as the brass elevator doors chimed open. Jamal, my future brother-in-law, stepped out alongside his father Richard. Jamal was a brilliant orthopedic surgeon, tall and handsome, with a warm smile that genuinely reached his eyes. He came from a highly respected African-American family in Atlanta. His father Richard was a formidable venture capitalist, a self-made corporate titan who commanded every room he entered. Jamal spotted me and waved. "Hey, Claire!" he called out, walking over to give me a quick hug. "Thank you so much for helping out with the florist. Thomas mentioned you handled the last-minute mix-up." I smiled politely. "It was no problem at all, Jamal." Richard stood slightly behind his son. He was a man of few words, his sharp, dark eyes taking in everything. He did not have the relaxed, naive demeanor of his son. Richard missed nothing. Before I could formally greet Richard, my mother came sweeping down the corridor. "Oh, Jamal, Richard, there you are," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She practically pushed me aside to stand between us. In my left hand, I was holding a small, customized welcome gift bag that the hotel staff had given me at check-in. Without missing a beat, my mother reached over and snatched it right out of my grip. She did not even look at me. "I am going to just take this up to one of the bridesmaids," she said to Jamal, acting as though I was a bellhop. "Claire is just heading to her room anyway." Jamal looked slightly confused, but nodded. Richard, however, did not smile. His gaze shifted from the stolen gift bag in my mother's hand directly to my face. For a fraction of a second, his eyes locked onto mine. It was a silent, intense acknowledgement. He saw exactly what had just happened. He saw the toxic family dynamic instantly. I gave him a subtle nod and then turned on my heel, walking toward my closet-sized room by the service elevator. The next morning, the hotel was buzzing with wedding day chaos. I was standing in front of the tiny mirror in my room, securing the clasp on my pearl necklace. It was a delicate vintage piece, and the only thing I had left from my late biological father. He had bought it for me before he passed away when I was 10. I never took it off for special occasions. The door to my room flew open without a knock. My mother barged in holding a steaming cup of coffee. She took one look at me and stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes zeroing in on my neck. "Take that off," she demanded, pointing at the pearls. I turned around confused. "Excuse me, Brittany needs a something old for her bridal look," my mother said, stepping closer and waving her free hand impatiently. "Those pearls are perfect. They will look stunning with the neckline of her gown." "Take them off, Claire." I felt a hot spike of anger in my chest. "No," I replied calmly. "These were a gift from my dad. Brittany has plenty of vintage jewelry from Thomas. She is not wearing my father's pearls." My mother's face twisted into a sneer. "You are always so bitter, Claire. You have always been jealous of your sister's happiness. It is just a necklace. Stop trying to ruin her wedding day with your petty resentment." Before I could tell her to get out of my room, the doorway darkened. My stepdad Thomas stepped inside, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked at me with pure disdain. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. "Claire is throwing a tantrum over a piece of jewelry," my mother sighed, playing the exhausted victim. "She refuses to let Brittany borrow it for the photos." Thomas took a step toward me, towering over my frame. "Listen to me very carefully, Claire," he growled. "I am paying a fortune for this weekend. If you upset the bride, I will personally call hotel security and have you escorted off the property. You will miss the wedding, and I will make sure Jamal's family knows you were thrown out for acting like an unstable lunatic. Now hand over the necklace." I looked at Thomas. I looked at the man who was currently stealing millions of dollars, threatening to kick me out of a hotel he was paying for with stolen funds. If I fought back now, I would be thrown out. I would miss the reception. I would miss my chance to watch his entire house of cards collapse. So I swallowed my pride. I reached up, unhooked the clasp, and placed the pearls into my mother's outstretched palm. That is what I thought, Thomas sneered. Try to smile today, Claire. It will not kill you. They turned and walked out, leaving my door wide open. I did not cry. I walked over and shut the door. Then I went to my suitcase and pulled out my laptop. I sat on the edge of the uncomfortable bed and woke up the screen. I opened the encrypted folder on my desktop. For the past 3 months, my forensic accounting firm had been hired by Richard's venture capital company to audit Thomas's logistics business ahead of a massive $80 million acquisition. Thomas thought his books were perfectly cooked. He thought he had hidden the phantom vendors, the fake loans, and the offshore accounts. But Thomas did not know that his plain, boring stepdaughter was the lead investigator on his file. I scrolled through the unredacted bank statements on my screen. I saw the exact wire transfer that paid for Brittany's Vera Wang dress. I saw the fraudulent loan that covered this Ritz Carlton ballroom. I saw my mother's forged signature on the shell company documents. Every single dime funding this extravagant wedding was embezzled directly from Richard's company. I closed my laptop and slid it back into my bag. I smoothed down my dress. Let them have the pearls for a few hours. By the end of the night, I would take everything else. The wedding ceremony went off without a hitch. Brittany walked down the aisle looking like a bridal magazine cover, wearing my father's pearls around her neck. Jamal looked at her with complete adoration, entirely unaware of the viper he was marrying. During the family portrait session out in the courtyard, the isolation continued. The photographer asked the immediate family to gather around the newlyweds. I took a step forward, but Brittany immediately held up her hand. "Only real family in this shot," she announced loudly. "Let us just do the parents." Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his custom tuxedo. He looked at me, an apologetic grimace on his face, but he stayed silent. He chose to keep the peace with his new bride, rather than defend his sister-in-law. Jamal's elegant mother, who was standing nearby, tried to intervene. She reached out and gently grasped my forearm. "Nonsense," she said warmly. "Come join us, Claire. We want everyone in the picture." Before I could move, my mother physically stepped between us. She grabbed Jamal's mother by the arm, pulling her away from me. "Oh, do not worry about Claire," my mother whispered loudly enough for half the courtyard to hear. "She has a history of being a bit emotionally unstable. She prefers to stand on the sidelines anyway. It is just better for everyone." I stood alone on the manicured grass, watching them smile for the cameras. The toxic circle was completely closed and I was locked out, but that was exactly where I needed to be. An hour later, the cocktail hour began in the grand foyer. Waiters circled the room with silver trays of champagne and caviar. Thomas was holding court at the massive ice sculpture bar, aggressively networking with Richard's wealthy business associates. I stood nearby, sipping a plain club soda. Thomas was talking so loudly that his voice carried over the string quartet. "The upcoming merger is going to set a new industry standard," Thomas boasted, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. "Our financials are flawless. My logistics company has seen a 20% profit margin increase this quarter alone. We run a tight, clean ship." I watched him dig his own grave with every boastful word. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Richard separate himself from a group of investors and walk purposefully toward me. He stood beside me, facing the crowd, acting as though he was just enjoying the music. "Are the encrypted files you sent my legal team this morning fully verified?" Richard asked softly. His voice barely rose above a whisper, but the intensity in his tone was unmistakable. I took a slow sip of my club soda, never taking my eyes off Thomas. "Down to the last forged catering receipt," I replied calmly. Richard nodded once, his jaw tight. He watched Thomas laugh and clap another investor on the shoulder. "He thinks he is a very smart man," Richard noted coldly. "He is about to learn otherwise," I said. Richard turned his head and finally looked directly at me. I saw the quiet, calculated fury burning in his dark eyes, a fury that perfectly matched my own. "Thank you, Claire," he murmured. He walked away seamlessly, rejoining the crowd. Nobody else in the room had any idea that a financial death sentence had just been handed down. The trap was set, the irrefutable evidence was delivered, and the executioner was simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Dragging my suitcase down the service corridor felt like walking into a completely different hotel. The plush, intricate carpets of the main lobby vanished, replaced by dull industrial flooring that squeaked under my shoes. The soft ambient music faded away, replaced by the loud mechanical hum of the service elevators and the clanking of housekeeping carts. This was where my mother had banished me. I was the maid of honor in name, only pushed into the shadows so my stepsister Brittany could have the sprawling luxury suite I had paid for. I reached the door of my assigned room and pulled out the plastic keycard my mother had shoved into my hand. Before I could even slide it into the slot, a heavy hand slammed against the doorframe inches from my face. I jumped back, startled. There stood my stepdad Thomas. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, a gold Rolex gleaming on his wrist. He did not smile. He did not ask about my flight from Chicago. He did not even say hello. His face was flushed, his jaw tight with irritation, and he looked down at me with the same disdain he had shown me since I was a teenager. "Take care of this immediately," Thomas ordered. He thrust a thick piece of paper against my chest. I instinctively brought my hands up to catch it before it fell. I looked down at the document. It was a final notice invoice from the elite floral designer they had hired for the wedding. The total balance due immediately was $5,000. I stared at the bold red numbers at the bottom of the page, then looked back up at Thomas. "I am sorry," I said calmly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "What is this?" "It is the florist bill," Claire Thomas snapped, running a hand through his silver hair. "Do you need me to read it to you? The vendor is threatening to pull the centerpieces and the floral arch if the final balance is not settled in the next 10 minutes. "Then you should probably pay him," I replied, holding the paper back out toward him. Thomas let out a harsh, patronizing sigh. He crossed his arms, refusing to take the invoice. "I cannot do that right now," he said, his voice dropping into a low, authoritative growl. "My corporate accounts are temporarily frozen. It is standard procedure. We are in the final stages of a massive $80 million merger, and my liquid assets are locked up in escrow. I cannot authorize a $5,000 wire without triggering a mountain of red tape with the auditors." I looked at him. The sheer audacity of the man standing in front of me was breathtaking. Thomas was the CEO of a major logistics company. He drove a customized imported sports car and drank scotch that cost $1,000 a bottle. Yet here he was, cornering his stepdaughter in a dingy service hallway, demanding she foot the bill for his golden child's extravagant wedding. "You want me to pay $5,000 for flowers?" I asked, making sure to enunciate every word. "Do not play dumb with me." "Claire," Thomas sneered, stepping closer so he towered over me. "I know you have the money. You are 35 years old. You have no husband, no children, and you live in a cheap apartment. You do not have any real expenses. You can float this for a few days. I will pay you back on Monday when the merger clears." He leaned in closer, his voice turning threatening. "If you do not pay this right now, the florist leaves. Brittany will walk into an empty ballroom. Your mother will have a complete nervous breakdown, and I will make absolutely certain that every single person in this family knows it was your fault because you were too cheap and too selfish to help out in a crisis. Do you understand me?" I stood frozen in the hallway, clutching the heavy cardstock of the invoice. I did not feel fear. I did not feel intimidated. Instead, I felt a sharp, cold wave of clarity wash over me. Because Thomas was lying. His corporate accounts were not frozen due to a standard merger procedure. I knew this for an absolute fact. As a senior forensic accountant, I was the lead investigator assigned to audit his company on behalf of the venture capital firm planning to acquire it. I had spent the last 3 months buried in his financial records. I knew exactly why his liquid cash was tight this weekend. It was because he had been desperately moving millions of dollars into offshore shell companies to hide his massive embezzlement scheme before the auditors could find it. He thought he was dealing with faceless corporate accountants. He had absolutely no idea that the person tracking his stolen money was the quiet, unassuming stepdaughter he was currently bullying in a hallway. I looked at the invoice again. I noticed a handwritten note at the bottom of the page. It listed a specific routing number and an off-the-books business account that Thomas had clearly instructed the florist to use. He was not just making me pay for the flowers. He was using my clean bank account to launder a direct payment to a vendor he owed money to, keeping his own fingerprints off the transaction. It was the final perfect piece of evidence I needed to prove his intent to defraud. "Fine," I said softly. My voice was completely flat. "I will pay it." The tension immediately left Thomas's shoulders. A smug, victorious smile spread across his face. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, clearly satisfied that he had easily crushed my resistance. "That is a good girl," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I knew you would see reason. You always do what you are told eventually." I pulled my phone out of my purse and opened my banking application. I typed in the vendor details and the $5,000 amount. I hit confirm. I held the screen up so Thomas could see the bright green checkmark, indicating the transfer was complete. "Perfect," Thomas said, turning on his heel. "Get dressed, Claire, and try not to look so miserable tonight. It is a celebration." He walked away, disappearing around the corner toward the luxury suites. He did not look back. He never did. I waited until the sound of his expensive leather shoes faded away completely. Then I turned my attention back to the piece of paper in my hand. I opened the secure camera application on my phone. I flattened the invoice against the wall under the harsh fluorescent hallway light. I took a high-resolution photograph, ensuring the handwritten routing numbers and the vendor details were crystal clear. I flipped the paper over and photographed the back just to be thorough. Within seconds, I uploaded the images directly to my firm's encrypted server, dropping them straight into the massive federal fraud file labeled with Thomas's name. I finally pushed my keycard into the door slot. The lock clicked, and I pushed the heavy door open. The room was exactly as terrible as I expected. It was cramped, smelling faintly of bleach and old dust. The bed was barely wider than a cot, and the single window looked out over a brick alleyway filled with dumpsters. I dragged my suitcase inside and let the door shut heavily behind me. I walked over to the small wooden desk in the corner and set my purse down. I did not sit on the bed and cry. I did not call a friend to complain about how unfairly my family treated me. I was far past the point of seeking sympathy. Instead, I pulled my laptop out of my bag and booted it up. I watched the screen glow to life, casting a blue light across the dark room. Thomas thought he had just extorted $5,000 out of a weak, pathetic woman. He thought his intimidation tactics had worked perfectly. He thought he was untouchable. I opened my audit file and watched the new evidence sync to the database. Thomas had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire life. The match was struck. The fuse was lit. All I had to do now was wait for the explosion. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. The quiet hum of the service elevator shaft next door was a steady reminder of exactly where my family thought I belonged. But I could not hide in this cramped room all afternoon. As a member of the bridal party, I was expected to be down in the main lobby, handing out luxury welcome bags to the out-of-town guests arriving for the weekend. I smoothed the wrinkles from my travel dress, picked up my purse, and headed back down. The contrast between my hallway and the main lobby was staggering. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the imported marble floors. A grand piano played softly in the corner. I walked over to the concierge desk, where 24 velvet gift bags were lined up perfectly. Each bag contained expensive champagne, customized chocolates, and a handwritten note from Brittany and Jamal. Of course, I was the one who had actually assembled them, but Brittany had signed her name with a flourish. I stood behind the table, organizing the bags by guest name. My mother, Diane, was hovering nearby. She was holding a flute of champagne, chatting loudly with a group of early arrivals, making sure everyone knew how much the weekend cost. She was doing absolutely none of the work but positioning herself perfectly to take all the credit. The heavy brass doors at the front entrance slid open. The afternoon sunlight poured into the lobby, and I looked up to see Jamal and his father Richard stepping inside. Jamal looked incredibly handsome in a tailored navy sport coat. He was an orthopedic surgeon, brilliant and kind-hearted. He had a warm, infectious smile that immediately put people at ease. Jamal came from a highly respected, affluent African-American family in Atlanta. He was genuinely a good man, but he was completely oblivious to the toxic reality of the family he was marrying into. Brittany had spent the last 2 years carefully curating a flawless, sweet persona specifically for him. She played the perfect, loving fiancé, and Jamal bought it completely. Walking right beside him was his father, Richard. If Jamal was warm and inviting, Richard was an absolute force of nature. Richard was a self-made venture capitalist who had built an empire from the ground up. He moved with a quiet, commanding authority that demanded respect, without him ever having to raise his voice. He wore a crisp, dark suit, and his sharp, observant eyes scanned the lobby, taking in every single detail in a matter of seconds. Richard was not a man who missed anything. Jamal spotted me behind the table and his face lit up. He walked over, leaving his luggage with the bellhop. "Claire, it is so great to see you," Jamal said, pulling me into a warm hug. "I am so glad you made it safely from Chicago. Thomas just texted me and said there was a last-minute mix-up with the florist, but that you stepped in and handled it. Thank you so much for doing that. I know Brittany is stressed, and we really appreciate you keeping things running smoothly." I forced a polite smile. Thomas had spun the story perfectly to make himself look like a busy executive delegating a minor issue while making sure Jamal knew I was just the reliable help. "It was not a problem at all, Jamal," I replied evenly. "I am just happy to help." Richard stepped up beside his son. He did not offer a hug, but extended a firm hand. "It is good to see you again, Claire," he said. His voice was deep and resonant. "Likewise, Richard," I said, shaking his hand. Before we could exchange another word, the sharp clicking of high heels echoed across the marble floor. My mother had spotted the two most important men in the room and immediately abandoned her conversation to swoop in. "Oh, Jamal, Richard, you made it." My mother practically sang, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She stepped right between me and Jamal, physically blocking me from the conversation. "We are just so thrilled you are finally here. The bridal suite is completely ready for you, Jamal." I took a step back, letting her dominate the space. I reached down to the table and picked up one of the customized velvet welcome bags. It was specifically tagged for one of Brittany's sorority sisters who was walking through the doors right behind Jamal. Without missing a beat, my mother turned around and snatched the heavy velvet bag right out of my hands. She did it aggressively, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric. She did not even look at me. "I am going to just take this over to Ashley," my mother announced to Jamal, acting as though I was an invisible servant standing behind a counter. "Claire is just helping out behind the scenes today. You know she prefers not to mingle with the guests. She is perfectly happy hiding in the background." Jamal looked slightly confused by the sudden aggressive movement and the passive-aggressive comment. He blinked clearly, not understanding why my mother had just ripped a gift bag out of my hands when there were 24 more sitting on the table. But Jamal was too polite to say anything. He just offered an awkward, accommodating smile. Richard, however, did not smile. He did not look at my mother. He did not look at the velvet bag. His dark, piercing eyes were locked entirely on me. For a long, heavy moment, the bustling noise of the Ritz Carlton lobby seemed to completely fade away. Richard watched the way I stood perfectly still, my empty hands dropping to my sides. He saw the tight, controlled expression on my face. He recognized the profound disrespect that had just occurred in broad daylight. In the corporate world, Richard dealt with sharks, manipulators, and frauds every single day. He knew what a power play looked like. He knew what intentional humiliation looked like. Richard shifted his gaze slightly, tracing the dynamic between my mother's boastful posturing and my quiet isolation. The air between us cracked with unspoken realization. It was a silent, intense acknowledgement. Richard saw exactly how I was being treated. He saw that I was the scapegoat, the punching bag, the designated loser in my mother's twisted family hierarchy. I held his gaze. I did not look away, and I did not look down. I let him see that I was not broken. I let him see the cold, calculating calm behind my eyes. I wanted him to understand that I was not just a victim taking the abuse. I was a quiet observer taking notes. Richard gave me a barely perceptible nod. It was so subtle that nobody else in the room could have possibly caught it. But I did. "Well, we should get upstairs and get settled," Richard said, finally, breaking the silence. His tone was perfectly polite, but the temperature of his voice had dropped considerably. He turned to Jamal. "Let us go. We have a long evening ahead of us." "Of course," Jamal agreed, turning back to me. "Thanks again for the help, Claire. I will see you at the rehearsal dinner tonight." I watched them walk toward the gold-plated elevators. My mother immediately trotted off to fawn over Brittany's friends, leaving me standing completely alone behind the table. I looked back down at the neatly arranged rows of gift bags. My mother thought she had just put me in my place. She thought she had successfully reminded me that I was nothing more than the family servant. But as I watched the elevator doors close behind Richard, a slow, genuine smile finally crept onto my face. Richard was the final boss in this entire equation. He was the man holding the keys to the $80 million acquisition that Thomas was desperately banking on to cover his financial crimes. And Richard was not a fool. He was already questioning the narrative my family was trying to sell him. He was already seeing the cracks in their perfect facade. My stepdad had handed me the financial evidence. My mother was currently handing Richard the character evidence. They were digging their own graves in perfectly synchronized harmony. I reached under the table and pulled out the next gift bag. The rehearsal dinner was only a few hours away. The insults would inevitably continue. The subtle jabs would escalate. Brittany would demand the spotlight, and my parents would happily sacrifice my dignity to give it to her. But none of it hurt anymore. Because for the first time in my 35 years of existence, I was not just bracing for the impact of their cruelty. I was actively steering them straight into a brick wall, and the best part was they were stepping on the gas pedal all by themselves. I barely slept that night. The heavy mechanical gears of the service elevator ground against the wall of my cramped room every 15 minutes, rattling the cheap headboard. By 6 o'clock on Saturday morning, I gave up on rest entirely. I threw off the thin hotel blanket and walked over to the tiny bathroom. Today was the day. The climax of a 2-year charade. I showered and began to get ready for the early morning family portraits. I slipped into my designated bridesmaid dress. It was a dull, shapeless navy blue gown that Brittany had intentionally chosen to make sure none of her bridesmaids could possibly draw any attention away from her perfect bridal glow. I did not care about the dress. I cared about what I was pairing with it. I walked over to my suitcase and pulled out a small, worn velvet jewelry box. I opened it carefully, revealing a simple, elegant string of pearls. They were not exceptionally large, nor were they perfectly uniform, but to me they were the most valuable thing in the world. My biological father had given them to me on my 10th birthday just 6 months before he passed away from a sudden heart attack. He had saved up for months from his modest salary as a high school science teacher to buy them for me. He told me they were for my wedding day. After he died, my mother Diane wasted no time finding a replacement. Within a year, she married Thomas, a wealthy logistics executive, who came with his own spoiled daughter Brittany. From that moment on, my father's memory was completely erased from our household. His photos were taken down, his belongings were donated, and my mother fully assimilated into Thomas's affluent, superficial world. The pearls were the only physical reminder I had left of a man who actually loved me unconditionally. I lifted the necklace from the velvet and fastened the gold clasp around my neck. The pearls felt cool and comforting against my skin. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, feeling a quiet sense of strength. Suddenly, the door to my room flew open. There was no knock. There was never a knock when it came to my mother. "Claire, are you decent?" she snapped, barging into the room with a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. She was already in full makeup, her hair perfectly styled, wearing a lavish silk robe. "The photographer is going to be downstairs in 45 minutes, and Brittany is having an absolute crisis." I turned around to face her. What kind of crisis? I asked calmly. Her vintage diamond choker snapped when the stylist was putting it on her, my mother said, waving her free hand frantically. The clasp is completely ruined. She is in tears. It was supposed to be her something old. I have been running around this entire hotel trying to find a replacement before she ruins her makeup. My mother suddenly stopped talking. Her eyes darted to my neck. She took a step closer, her gaze locked onto the pearls resting against my collarbone. Are those your father's pearls? She asked. Her tone shifting instantly from frantic to calculating. Yes, I replied, my hands instinctively reaching up to touch them. Take them off, she commanded. She did not ask. She did not phrase it as a favor. It was a direct order. I stared at her, genuinely taken aback by the sheer audacity. Excuse me. Take them off right now, Claire, my mother repeated, setting her coffee cup down on the small wooden desk. They are perfect. They have that classic vintage look Brittany needs for her neckline. Bring them to the bridal suite immediately. This is exactly what we need to calm her down. I felt a hot spike of anger ignite in my chest. I took a deliberate step back. No, I said firmly. These are my pearls. Dad gave them to me. I am wearing them today. My mother rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh, patronizing sigh. Oh, for heaven's sake, Claire, do not be so dramatic. It is just a necklace. Brittany is the bride. She is the center of attention today, not you. Nobody is even going to be looking at you in those family photos anyway. That is exactly why I'm wearing them, I replied, keeping my voice steady, despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. Brittany has a dozen other pieces of jewelry. Thomas just bought her a massive sapphire pendant last month. She can wear that. She is not wearing my father's pearls. The polite, flustered mother of the bride routine instantly vanished. Diane's face hardened, her lips pressing into a thin, cruel line. The mask dropped completely, revealing the toxic, manipulative woman I had dealt with my entire life. Do you really want to do this right now? She hissed, stepping into my personal space. Do you really want to be the reason your sister's wedding morning is ruined? You have always been like this, Claire, so utterly incapable of generosity, so fiercely protective of your little miseries. I am not being miserable, I shot back. I am setting a boundary. This necklace is the only thing I have left of my dad. Thomas has forbidden us from even mentioning his name in the house for the last 20 years. And now you want me to hand over his only gift to decorate Thomas's daughter? The answer is no. My mother scoffed, crossing her arms over her silk robe. Do not try to make this about Thomas. I know exactly what this is really about. You are jealous. I stared at her. Jealous of a broken necklace. No, my mother spat, her voice dripping with venom. You are jealous of Brittany. You always have been. From the day we moved into Thomas's house, you resented her because she was outgoing, popular, and beautiful, and now you cannot stand the fact that she is marrying Jamal. She is marrying a brilliant, successful, wealthy surgeon from a highly respected family who adores her. Meanwhile, you are 35 years old, completely alone, living in a mediocre apartment in Chicago, crunching numbers on a calculator for a living. Her words were designed to cut me down to the bone. It was her favorite tactic. Whenever I stood up for myself, she would immediately pivot to attacking my career, my relationship status, and my worth as a woman. She wanted to make me feel so small, so insignificant, that I would surrender just to stop the verbal assault. The supreme irony of her insulting my career almost made me laugh out loud. She thought I was just crunching numbers on a calculator. She had no idea that those exact numbers I was crunching were about to send her husband to federal prison and leave her completely bankrupt. I held that secret tightly in my chest, letting her words bounce off my armor. You are pathetic, Claire, she continued, leaning in closer. You are trying to hoard a cheap string of beads just to feel some sort of hollow victory over your sister on the most important day of her life. It is sad. It really is. I looked into my mother's eyes. I did not see any love there. I did not see any maternal instinct. I just saw a woman who had sold her soul for a zip code and a country club membership, and who despised me because I was a constant reminder of the modest life she had left behind. She reached out her manicured fingers, grazing my neck as she tried to unhook the clasp herself. I immediately swatted her hand away. "Do not touch me," I warned, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. My mother gasped, clutching her hand to her chest, as if I had just violently struck her. "I am your mother!" she shrieked, playing the ultimate victim. "I put a roof over your head after your father died and left us with absolutely nothing. I made sure you went to a good college. I gave you a family. And this is how you repay me. By acting like a selfish, bitter spinster when your family actually needs you." I stood my ground. "You did not give me a family, Diane. You gave me a landlord. Thomas has treated me like a burden since day one, and you let him. You let Brittany treat me like dirt because it secured your position in his mansion. You can call me bitter. You can call me selfish. You can call me whatever you want. But you are not getting these pearls." My mother glared at me, her chest heaving with manufactured outrage. She realized her emotional manipulation was not working. The guilt trip had failed. The insults had failed to break my resolve. "Fine," she sneered, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Have it your way. But do not think for 1 second that this conversation is over. You are going to regret this, Claire. I promise you that." She turned on her heel and stormed out of the tiny room, leaving the door wide open behind her. I stood in the silence of the room, my heart pounding heavily against my ribs. I reached up and clutched the pearls, my fingers trembling slightly from the adrenaline. I knew she was not going to let this go. Diane never lost an argument without calling for backup. She was going to go straight to Thomas. She was going to spin a wild narrative about how I had verbally abused her and refused to help the family in a moment of crisis. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I walked over to the door and closed it. Let them come. Let them push me as hard as they wanted today. They had no idea that every insult they threw at me was only sealing their own fate. I did not have to wait long. Less than 5 minutes later, the heavy sound of angry, purposeful footsteps echoed down the uncarpeted service hallway. The brass doorknob of my room rattled violently before the door was shoved open, hitting the adjacent wall with a loud, aggressive thud. Thomas stood in the doorway, his massive frame practically blocking out the dim light from the corridor. My mother hovered right behind his left shoulder, a look of vindictive triumph plastered across her perfectly made-up face. She had gone straight to her husband to weaponize his authority against me, just as she had done since I was a teenager. Thomas was already dressed for the ceremony in his custom-tailored charcoal tuxedo. The crisp white fabric of his shirt and the perfectly tied silk bow tie stood in stark contrast to the dark, ugly rage twisting his features. He stepped into my cramped room without asking for permission, forcing me to take a step back until the back of my knees hit the edge of the cheap hotel mattress. "What is this absolute nonsense I am hearing about a necklace?" Thomas demanded. His voice was low and gravelly, vibrating with a dangerous authority that he usually reserved for terrifying his corporate subordinates at the logistics firm. "It is not nonsense, Thomas," I said, forcing my voice to remain perfectly steady, despite the intimidating proximity of his massive frame. "I am wearing my father's pearls. They belong to me. They were a gift." Diane barged in here and demanded I hand them over to decorate Brittany. Thomas did not even blink. He took another deliberate step forward, entirely invading my personal space. The heavy, suffocating scent of his expensive designer cologne mixed with the stale, dusty air of the tiny staff room. "Listen to me very carefully, Claire," he growled, leaning down so his face was only inches from mine. "I am not going to stand in this pathetic little closet and debate property rights with you on the morning of my daughter's wedding. I have spent over $300,000 on this weekend. I have flown in hundreds of wealthy guests from across the country. I am currently hosting the most important business associates of my entire career down in the Grand Lobby. I will not allow your pathetic petty jealousy to ruin the mood of my beautiful bride. I am not trying to ruin anything," I said, refusing to break eye contact and holding my ground. "I just want to keep the one thing that actually belongs to my dad. Brittany has a vault full of expensive jewelry. She does not need the one piece of history I have left." "Do not interrupt me." Thomas snapped, his face turning an angry shade of red. He raised a thick hand and pointed a finger directly at my face. You are going to take that necklace off right now, and you are going to hand it to your mother. If you refuse, I will turn around, walk down to the lobby, and personally speak to the head of hotel security. He let that threat hang in the air for a second before continuing, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. I am a very important VIP guest at this Ritz Carlton, Claire. I will tell the security staff that you are an unstable, unwanted guest who is aggressively harassing the bridal party. I will have you physically dragged out of this hotel by uniformed guards. My mother peeked out from behind him, her eyes gleaming with malice. You really should just listen to him, Claire, she chimed in. You are embarrassing yourself. Do you really want that? Claire Thomas asked, a cruel, mocking smirk starting to form on his lips. Do you want Jamal and his entire elegant, high-class family to watch you get thrown out onto the street like a common trespasser? Because I will make absolutely sure they are all standing in the lobby when it happens. I will walk right up to Richard and Jamal and tell them that you had a severe mental breakdown. I will tell them you lost your mind out of pure bitter jealousy because no man has ever wanted to marry you. Your reputation will be completely destroyed, and you will spend the rest of this weekend sitting entirely alone in an airport terminal while we celebrate. I stared at the man standing in front of me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to fight back. I wanted to yell. I wanted to slap his pointing finger away from my face. I wanted to tell him that he was nothing but a common greedy thief wearing a luxury suit. But the deeply analytical side of my brain kicked in. The senior forensic auditor, who had spent years learning how to completely dismantle an opponent, realized exactly what was at stake. I analyzed his threat the same way I would analyze a fraudulent balance sheet. If I let my pride win this immediate battle, I would inevitably lose the entire war. If Thomas called security and used his immense wealth and influence to have me thrown out of the hotel, I would not be at the reception tonight. I would not be sitting at my assigned table when the trap finally snapped shut. I desperately needed to be in that ballroom. I needed to see the look of absolute horror on his face when Richard exposed the massive financial fraud to the entire room. I needed to be standing there when the federal agents I had tipped off walked through the venue doors with handcuffs. This wedding was the culmination of a grueling 3-month federal investigation, and I was the primary witness, holding all the unredacted documents. I could not let a piece of jewelry, no matter how emotionally significant it was to me, jeopardize the ultimate destruction of Thomas and his corrupt empire. He thought he had all the leverage. He thought his stolen money and his fake status made him a god in this room. He had absolutely no idea that he was threatening the very person holding absolute power over his future freedom. I took a deep, shaky breath, playing the part of the defeated, submissive stepdaughter perfectly. I let my shoulders slump forward. I broke eye contact and looked down at the dull, scuffed floorboards of the room. Fine, I whispered, ensuring my voice sounded hollow and thoroughly broken. That is exactly what I thought, Thomas sneered. His entire posture relaxed into a stance of absolute, untouchable arrogance. I reached up to the back of my neck. My fingers trembled slightly, not from fear or sadness, but from the massive amount of adrenaline surging through my veins. I found the small gold clasp of the pearl necklace. With a soft click, it opened. I pulled the delicate string of pearls away from my collarbone. The sudden absence of the cool beads left my skin feeling oddly bare and vulnerable. I looked at the necklace resting in my palm for a fraction of a second, silently apologizing to the memory of my father. Then I extended my hand toward my mother. Diane did not hesitate for a single second. She lunged forward and snatched the pearls right out of my open hand. Her eyes widened with a sickening level of greedy satisfaction. She immediately held the necklace up to the harsh overhead light, inspecting the beads to make sure I had not damaged them out of spite, before carefully slipping the jewelry into the deep pocket of her expensive silk robe. "Thank you, Claire," my mother said. Her voice instantly returned to that fake, sugary tone she always used when other people were watching. "I am so glad you finally decided to act like an adult and be a team player. Brittany is going to look absolutely stunning in these today." Thomas adjusted the stiff cuffs of his tuxedo shirt, looking down his nose at me with utter contempt. "Let this be a lesson to you, Claire," he said coldly. "In the real world, people who contribute absolutely nothing get no say in how things are run. Try to remember your place for the rest of the day. Do not speak unless you are spoken to. Do not cause any more childish drama. Just stand quietly in the background where you belong, and let your sister shine." Without waiting for my response, Thomas turned around and confidently walked out of the room. Diane offered me one last patronizing, victorious smile before turning and quickly following her husband down the hallway. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind them, clicking loudly as the metal latch caught. I was completely alone again. The room was suffocatingly silent save for the mechanical hum of the elevator shaft next door. I stood in the exact same spot for a long time, staring at the closed wooden door. I raised my hand and touched my bare neck. They had taken my father's memory. They had humiliated me. They had threatened to ruin my reputation in front of the only decent people at this wedding. But as I stood there in the quiet room, a slow, icy smile spread across my face. They had won the morning. They had successfully bullied me into submission. But they had just guaranteed that my revenge would be absolute and merciless. I walked back over to the small mirror and looked at my reflection. My eyes were hard and unyielding. I did not need the vintage pearls to be strong. I was walking into that wedding ceremony armed with something much more powerful than jewelry. I was walking in with the truth, and the truth was about to burn their entire fake world straight to the ground. I walked over to the small, scuffed desk pushed against the far wall of the room and pulled my laptop out of its protective case. The metal felt cold against my palms. I sat down on the hard wooden chair, opened the lid, and typed in my complex alphanumeric password. The screen flickered to life, illuminating my face in the dim room. I did not shed a single tear for the stolen pearls. Tears were a currency I had stopped spending on my family a long time ago. Instead, I opened the encrypted virtual private network that connected directly to my firm's secure servers in Chicago. I am a senior forensic accountant. I specialize in corporate fraud, embezzlement, and complex financial asset tracing. For the last 10 years, I had built a reputation in the industry for being relentless. I was the person companies called when the numbers did not add up, when the balance sheets looked a little too perfect, or when millions of dollars quietly disappeared into the ether. I dug through the digital dirt, and I always found the buried bodies. My family had absolutely no idea what I actually did for a living. To them, I was just a boring, low-level bookkeeper. Diane thought I spent my days hunched over a calculator doing taxes for small businesses. Thomas thought I was too unambitious to understand high-level corporate finance. They fundamentally underestimated me because they only saw what they wanted to see. They saw a quiet, compliant stepdaughter. They did not see the predator lurking right beneath the surface. 3 months ago, my firm was retained by a prominent venture capital group based out of Atlanta. The firm was planning an $80 million acquisition of a mid-sized logistics company. The logistics company belonged to Thomas. When the file first landed on my desk, I almost rejected it due to the blatant conflict of interest. But as I began my preliminary review of the documents, I noticed something deeply disturbing. The financial architecture of Thomas's company was an intricate, fragile house of cards. It was beautiful on the outside, but structurally hollow on the inside. I did not recuse myself. I dug deeper. I opened the master file on my screen, now labeled simply Project T. The screen populated with dozens of interconnected spreadsheets, bank statements, wire transfer logs, and shell company registrations. This was the culmination of 3 months of grueling obsessive work. It was the digital autopsy of Thomas's entire empire. I clicked on a spreadsheet labeled Offshore Accounts. Thomas had set up a complex web of phantom vendors. These were fake companies registered to post office boxes in the Cayman Islands and Delaware that submitted massive invoices to his logistics firm for services that were never actually rendered. Thomas would approve the invoices, wire the money out of his corporate accounts, and then funnel those funds back into his own personal offshore trusts. It was classic textbook embezzlement, and it was happening on a massive scale. But the fraud did not stop there. Thomas was not just stealing from his own company to line his pockets. He was stealing to maintain an illusion. I opened another folder labeled Personal Expenditures. This was where the reality of my family's lavish lifestyle was brutally exposed. Every single luxury they flaunted was bought with stolen money. I scrolled down the list of recent wire transfers. There it was. A transfer of $45,000 from a phantom vendor account used directly to pay for Brittany's custom Vera Wang wedding gown. I scrolled further. A transfer of $120,000 used to secure the Ritz Carlton ballroom for this exact weekend. Another transfer of $80,000 used to buy the massive sapphire pendant Thomas had gifted Brittany just last month. And then I found the most damning document of all. It was a commercial loan application submitted to a major bank just 6 months ago, using Thomas's logistics company as collateral. The loan was for $2.5 million. But what made my blood run cold was the secondary signature on the guarantor line. It was my mother's signature. Diane had knowingly signed off on a fraudulent loan application, legally tying herself to the massive financial deception. She was not just a passive beneficiary of Thomas's crimes, she was an active co-conspirator. This entire wedding, this entire weekend of supposed luxury and high society was a complete fabrication. It was a desperate, glittering facade funded entirely by federal crimes. Thomas was burning through millions of stolen dollars to buy Brittany a perfect fairy tale, and he was banking on the $80 million acquisition by Richard's venture capital firm to cover up the massive holes in his balance sheets before anyone noticed. He was trying to steal from Richard to pay back what he had already stolen from his own company. I leaned back in the uncomfortable wooden chair, staring at the hard evidence glowing on my screen. The sheer arrogance of it all was breathtaking. Thomas truly believed he was the smartest man in the room. He believed he could outsmart the auditors, manipulate the venture capitalists, and continue living his lavish, fraudulent life without ever facing a single consequence. He thought he had all the power because he had the money. He did not realize that the money was exactly what was going to destroy him. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts, until I found the direct number for the lead federal investigator I had been coordinating with for the past month. I had already handed over 90% of the evidence. They were just waiting for my final confirmation before pulling the trigger. I opened a new text message. The final pieces are in place. I typed, my thumbs moving quickly across the screen. The florist invoice he forced me to pay yesterday directly links his personal accounts to the shell companies. The chain of evidence is complete. I am uploading the final unredacted files to the secure server now. I hit send. A moment later, the 3 gray typing bubbles appeared on the screen. Received, the investigator replied. Warrants have been signed. Agents are standing by in the area. We will move on your signal tonight. I set the phone face down on the desk. The trap was set. The steel jaws were open, waiting for Thomas to take that final, arrogant step. I looked at the clock on the bottom corner of my computer screen. It was time to head down for the family portraits. Time to play the role of the quiet, submissive stepdaughter one last time. Time to let them push me to the absolute edge, knowing that every single insult they hurled at me was only making their inevitable downfall that much sweeter. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, plunging the small room back into dim shadows. I stood up, smoothed down the cheap fabric of my bridesmaid dress, and walked out the door. I was not just walking into a wedding, I was walking into an execution. The heavy wooden doors of the hotel ballroom opened up to the sprawling outdoor courtyard. The wedding ceremony had just concluded. White rose petals were scattered across the perfectly manicured lawn, and the elegant wooden folding chairs were already being cleared away by the hotel staff. The afternoon air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the sweet perfume of wealthy guests making their way toward the open bar for the cocktail hour. I stood off to the side watching my family celebrate. Brittany was the absolute center of attention, surrounded by a swarm of bridesmaids who were busily adjusting her massive silk train and touching up her lipstick. The vintage pearls my father had given me rested perfectly against her collarbone, a stolen trophy proudly displayed for everyone to see. She laughed loudly, tilting her head back, playing the role of the radiant, blushing bride to absolute perfection. Over by the rose garden, the wedding photographer was clapping his hands together, trying to wrangle the remaining guests for the formal portraits. He was a frantic, high-energy man with two heavy cameras strapped across his chest. He checked a clipboard, shouting out names and group configurations, while his assistant adjusted a large silver light reflector. "I need the bride's immediate family over here by the floral arch," the photographer called out, waving his hand toward a beautifully constructed trellis of white roses and green ivy. "Parents and siblings of the bride, please step forward right now. Let us get this done while the natural lighting is still working for us." My mother Diane immediately rushed forward, dragging Thomas by the arm. They took their places on the left side of Brittany and Jamal. The photographer posed them carefully, adjusting Thomas's broad shoulders and politely telling my mother to tilt her chin down to catch the light. I took a deep breath, smoothed out the dull fabric of my navy blue bridesmaid dress, and walked over to join the group. I did not want to be in the picture. I did not want to stand next to these people and fake a smile for a leather-bound album that would eventually sit on a coffee table paid for with embezzled funds. But as a forensic auditor, I knew the importance of playing my part until the very last second. I walked up and stood on the far right side next to Jamal, leaving a polite amount of physical space between us. Before the photographer could even raise his camera to his eye, Brittany abruptly stepped out of her pose. She dropped Jamal's hand and turned her head to glare directly at me. "What are you doing?" Brittany asked. Her voice was incredibly sharp, slicing right through the light celebratory chatter of the courtyard. The photographer lowered his camera, looking completely confused. The prompt said "siblings of the bride," he offered, nervously checking his clipboard again to make sure he had not made a mistake. Brittany let out a short, mocking laugh. She pointed a French manicured finger directly at my chest. "I said I only want real family in this shot. She is just my stepsister, and honestly her dress is ruining the color palette of the frame." "Step out of the picture, Claire. You can be in the large group photo with the distant relatives later." A heavy, incredibly uncomfortable silence fell over the immediate area. Several of Jamal's extended family members who were waiting quietly nearby for their turn with the photographer turned their heads to look at the commotion. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks as dozens of eyes landed on me, but I kept my facial expression completely neutral. I looked over at my mother. Diane just adjusted her expensive silk wrap and looked away, pretending she was deeply interested in a nearby rose bush. Thomas actually smirked, clearly enjoying the public humiliation of his stepdaughter. I shifted my gaze to Jamal. This was the moment. This was the exact crossroad where the man Brittany was marrying could step up and prove his character. Jamal was a highly respected orthopedic surgeon. He was a man who made critical life-altering decisions in the operating room every single day. He came from a family that fiercely valued respect, dignity, and honor. I looked right into Jamal's eyes, waiting for him to say something. I waited for him to tell his new wife that her behavior was unacceptable. I waited for him to reach out, pull me back into the frame, and insist that family was family regardless of bloodlines. But Jamal did absolutely nothing. He looked at me, and I saw a flash of genuine guilt cross his handsome features. His jaw tightened, and he shifted his weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other. He looked down at the polished leather of his expensive dress shoes, unable to maintain eye contact with me. He was incredibly uncomfortable, but he was also incredibly weak. He chose to swallow his discomfort rather than cause a scene on his wedding day. He chose to keep the peace with his beautiful, toxic new bride rather than defend the woman who had just paid his florist bill and handled his logistics. He was completely blinded by the carefully curated version of Brittany. He wanted the perfect fairy tale romance so badly that he was willing to ignore the cruel monster standing right next to him. "I am sorry, Claire." Jamal mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper so the nearby guests would not hear. "Maybe it is just better if we do a quick one with just the parents first. We can do a sibling shot next." He was trying to soften the blow, but his words only made it infinitely worse. His silence was an active endorsement of their cruelty. By refusing to stand up for me, he had officially joined their ranks. I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply nodded my head once, taking a deliberate, measured step backward, moving completely out of the camera's view. "That is much better," Brittany chirped, her sweet fake smile instantly returning to her face as she grabbed Jamal's hand again. "Perfect. Make sure you get my good side." The photographer awkwardly raised his camera, clearly eager to just finish the job and get away from the toxic energy radiating from our group. The bright flashes began to go off in rapid succession, capturing the smiling faces of a family built entirely on lies, theft, and emotional abuse. I stood alone in the cool shadows of a large oak tree bordering the courtyard, watching them pose. Jamal's silence had just sealed his own fate. Up until that exact moment, I had felt a small sliver of pity for him. I knew the absolute financial devastation that was about to rain down on Thomas and Diane would inevitably destroy Jamal's life as well. I knew his perfect wedding day was going to end in a nightmare, and his heart was going to be shattered. But as I watched him smile brightly for the camera, his arm wrapped tightly around a woman wearing stolen vintage jewelry, that pity completely evaporated. Jamal was a good man, but he was choosing to be complicit. He was choosing to ignore the glaring red flags waving right in his face, because it was easier than confronting the ugly truth. He needed the brutal wake-up call that was coming just as much as the rest of them. I crossed my arms over my chest, watching the camera flash again and again. Let them have their perfect pictures. Let them document this exact moment in time. Because by tomorrow morning, these glossy photographs would not be a celebration of a beautiful, wealthy union. They would be federal evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy, and I was going to make sure every single person smiling in that photo paid the ultimate price. The camera flashed a few more times before the photographer finally lowered his heavy equipment. He gave a bright thumbs up to the group. "Perfect, we got it. Now let us bring in the groom's parents and the extended family to join the bride and groom." Jamal's mother, Sylvia, stepped forward from the small crowd of onlookers waiting on the patio. She was a vision of absolute grace. She wore an elegant emerald green evening gown that flowed beautifully as she walked across the manicured lawn. Unlike my mother, who constantly wore a mask of frantic, desperate energy, Sylvia possessed a quiet, grounded confidence. She radiated warmth and genuine kindness, her posture reflecting a lifetime of refined dignity. As she moved toward the white floral arch to take her place beside her son, Sylvia paused. She turned her head and scanned the sprawling courtyard. Her warm brown eyes found me standing entirely alone in the dark, cool shadows of the massive oak tree at the edge of the lawn. Sylvia frowned slightly, her maternal instincts clearly kicking in. She stepped away from the designated photo area and began walking directly toward me. "Claire, dear," Sylvia called out softly, extending a welcoming hand in my direction. "Come join us. We are doing the large family portraits now. We want absolutely everyone in the picture. You are going to be my daughter-in-law's sister, which means you are family to us too. Come on over here." For a brief second, I felt a genuine lump form in my throat. It was the first time all weekend that someone had spoken to me with actual warmth and inclusion. Jamal had stood by in silence while Brittany humiliated me, but his mother was actively trying to bridge the gap. I took half a step forward, intending to accept her kind invitation, but I did not even make it out of the shadow of the oak tree. My mother, Diane, possessed a terrifying, hyper-vigilant radar for any situation where she might lose control of the narrative. She spotted Sylvia approaching me from across the courtyard. Instantly, Diane abandoned her conversation with Thomas and practically sprinted across the lawn. Her sharp, high heels dug into the soft grass as she intercepted Sylvia halfway. "Oh, Sylvia," my mother practically sang, her voice dripping with that sickening artificial sweetness she reserved exclusively for wealthy people she wanted to impress. She physically stepped right between me and Jamal's mother, using her body to completely block Sylvia's path. My mother reached out and firmly grabbed Sylvia by the arm. It was framed as a friendly, intimate gesture, but the grip was tight and completely inappropriate. She leaned in close to Sylvia, but she intentionally kept her voice loud enough for me to hear every single word. "Please do not worry about Claire," my mother whispered, her tone shifting into one of exaggerated theatrical concern. She let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "It is so sweet of you to include her, but it really is better if we just leave her be. She prefers to stand on the sidelines." Sylvia looked down at my mother's hand, gripping her arm, clearly taken aback by the sudden physical contact and the intense interference. "But Claire is the maid of honor," Sylvia replied politely, trying to gently pull her arm away. "She should be in the photos with Jamal and Brittany. It is only right." My mother tightened her grip, leaning in even closer. "Sylvia, I am only telling you this because we are going to be family," my mother said, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial hiss. "Claire has a very long history of being emotionally unstable." I stood frozen under the tree, my nails digging into the palms of my hands. I watched my own mother effortlessly assassinate my character to a woman she barely knew. "She has always struggled with severe jealousy," my mother continued, shaking her head as if she carried a heavy, tragic burden. "Especially when it comes to Brittany. She cannot handle not being the center of attention. We had a terrible incident upstairs this morning. Claire threw an absolute tantrum over a piece of jewelry and tried to ruin her sister's morning. If we force her into these photos right now, she is likely to have an outburst and ruin the entire session. We have to walk on eggshells around her just to keep the peace. It is honestly exhausting." Sylvia listened to this barrage of horrible lies. She was a polite, well-bred woman who clearly did not want to cause a scene or ignite a massive family dispute at her son's wedding. She looked past my mother's shoulder, meeting my eyes for a brief, searching moment. I did not try to defend myself. I knew exactly how this toxic game was played. If I walked over there and argued with my mother, I would only be providing the exact outburst she had just invented. I would look unhinged. I would look bitter. I would play right into the toxic narrative she had spent the last 20 years carefully constructing. So I did the only thing I could do. I stood perfectly still. I kept my face entirely blank, devoid of any emotion. I let Sylvia see the cold, stoic reality of my existence. "I understand, Diane," Sylvia finally said, her voice tight and significantly less warm than it had been a moment ago. She gently but firmly removed my mother's hand from her arm. "We certainly do not want to cause any unnecessary stress for anyone today." My mother beamed, thrilled that her manipulation had worked so flawlessly. "Exactly," she chirped, linking her arm through Sylvia's and guiding her back toward the floral arch. "You understand completely. Raising two daughters can be so difficult when one is constantly struggling. Let us just go smile for the cameras and focus on the happy couple." I watched them walk away. Sylvia took her place next to Jamal, but she looked deeply uncomfortable. She did not possess the same piercing analytical observation skills as her husband Richard, but she knew something was fundamentally wrong with the dynamic she had just witnessed. She smoothed her emerald dress and offered a strained smile for the photographer. The bright flashes began to go off again. Click after click after click. The laughter and the loud instructions from the photographer drifted over the lawn, blending with the soft classical music playing from the patio speakers. I was completely isolated. I was a ghost haunting the edges of a celebration I had helped finance with my own bank account just 24 hours earlier. I watched my mother pose next to Thomas. They looked like the perfect, wealthy, loving parents. They looked untouchable. They had successfully cut me out of the photographs. They had successfully cut me out of the family narrative. They had poisoned my reputation with the groom's mother, ensuring that I would be viewed as the unstable, jealous spinster for the rest of the evening. I leaned my back against the rough bark of the oak tree. The total isolation did not break me. It did not make me want to run up to my cramped hotel room and cry into a pillow. It did exactly the opposite. It sharpened my focus into a deadly, unyielding point. Every time my mother lied about me, she added another layer of justification to what I was about to do. Every time Thomas smirked at my humiliation, he cemented his own fate. They were so busy trying to manage my behavior that they completely failed to manage their own reality. The cocktail hour was starting next. Thomas was going to walk into that grand foyer and start boasting to the venture capitalists. He was going to try and sell his fraudulent logistics company to the very people who were secretly funding the federal investigation against him. I pushed myself off the oak tree and smoothed down my dress one final time. I had played the role of the victim perfectly. I had let them win the photo session. Now it was time to move inside. It was time to watch Thomas brag about his fake empire, completely unaware that the architect of his destruction was standing quietly in the corner, holding the match. The transition from the sunlit courtyard into the grand foyer of the hotel felt like stepping onto a carefully constructed theatrical stage. The cocktail hour was already in full swing. A string quartet situated on a small elevated platform was playing classical renditions of modern pop songs, their music blending smoothly with the low murmur of 200 wealthy guests. Waiters in immaculate white jackets circulated through the crowd, balancing heavy silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and delicate caviar appetizers. I bypassed the trays of expensive alcohol and walked directly to the mahogany bar tucked into the far corner of the room. I asked the bartender for a simple club soda with a twist of lime. I did not want champagne. I needed my mind to be absolutely sharp. I took my drink and retreated to a quiet alcove near a massive marble pillar. It was the perfect vantage point. From here, I could see the entire room without being easily noticed by the people who had spent the entire morning trying to erase me. The room was informally divided into two distinct social camps. On one side were Brittany's friends, a loud collection of bridesmaids and sorority sisters, taking endless photos in front of a massive flower wall. On the other side of the room was the real power. That was where Richard's inner circle had congregated. These were older, established men in bespoke suits, venture capitalists, investment bankers, and corporate attorneys who moved millions of dollars with a single phone call. And right in the absolute center of that circle of power stood Thomas. He was holding a rocks glass filled with expensive amber scotch, completely in his element. Or at least the element he desperately wanted to belong to. Thomas was a large man, and he used his physical presence to dominate the space, leaning in close to the investors, slapping shoulders and laughing just a fraction too loudly. I took a slow sip of my club soda and watched him work the room. He was not just making polite wedding conversation, he was aggressively pitching his company. He was using his stepdaughter's wedding reception as an informal boardroom to secure his own financial survival. The logistics sector is completely ripe for consolidation right now, Thomas boasted, his voice carrying easily over the soft music. He gestured expansively with his free hand. The supply chain issues over the last 2 years wiped out the weak players. But our firm, we built a fortress. We run a tight, incredibly clean ship. I watched a silver-haired investor from Richard's firm nod politely, taking a sip of his martini. You have certainly scaled up aggressively, Thomas, the investor noted. The preliminary numbers we saw last month were impressive. Thomas beamed his chest, puffing out with pride. Wait until you see the finalized quarterly reports, he bragged, swirling the scotch in his glass. Our financials are absolutely flawless. We are looking at a 20% profit margin increase this quarter alone. When this merger with Richard's firm goes through next month, it is going to set a completely new industry standard. We are going to make everyone in this circle significantly richer. I stood in the shadows of the marble pillar, my fingers gripping the cool glass of my club soda. Listening to him speak was a surreal experience. It was like watching a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship, loudly trying to sell tickets to the lifeboats he had already set on fire. He was standing there bragging about a 20% profit margin increase. My mind instantly pulled up the unredacted digital spreadsheets I had submitted to the federal investigators just hours ago. I knew exactly where that 20% came from. It was not profit. It was a massive deficit that Thomas had temporarily plugged by funneling money through 3 different offshore shell companies registered to a post office box in Delaware. We have the most loyal vendor network in the entire tri-state area. Thomas continued, entirely unaware that his lead auditor was standing 40 feet away, mentally dismantling every word he spoke. They trust us because we pay on time, and we deal in absolute transparency. Transparency is the cornerstone of my entire corporate philosophy. The word transparency coming out of his mouth almost made me laugh out loud. His philosophy of transparency involved forging my mother's signature on commercial loan applications and extorting his stepdaughter in a hallway to pay for the very floral arrangements sitting on the tables around us. Thomas took a large gulp of his scotch and pointed a thick finger around the opulent room. "You have to spend money to make money, gentlemen," he declared. His face flushed with alcohol and arrogant pride. "Look around this room. Look at the floral installations. Look at the quality of the service. I do not believe in cutting corners. When I commit to something, I do it first class. My business is run the exact same way. Top-tier investments yield top-tier results." He was literally pointing at the direct evidence of his federal crimes and calling it a successful business strategy. He had stolen the money from his own company, jeopardized the livelihoods of hundreds of his own employees, and defrauded a major financial institution, all to rent this room and buy the illusion that he was a titan of industry. And he was arrogant enough to believe that the men standing in a circle around him were buying the illusion completely. But as I watched the faces of the investors, I noticed the subtle cracks. These men were not fools. They were apex predators in the financial world. They smiled and nodded at Thomas, but their eyes were cold and calculating. They let him talk. They let him boast. They let him fill the silence with his desperate, grandiose claims. Thomas thought he was charming them. He did not realize they were just gathering data. My mother, Diane, suddenly appeared at Thomas's side, slipping her arm through his. She had traded her silk robe for a breathtaking silver evening gown. She smiled radiantly at the investors, playing the role of the perfect supportive executive wife. "We are just so blessed," my mother chimed in, leaning her head against Thomas's shoulder. "Thomas works so incredibly hard for our family. He really is the smartest man I've ever known." The sickening display of mutual delusion was almost too much to watch. They were feeding off each other, building a towering monument to their own greed right in the middle of a crowded room. They had successfully bullied me into the shadows, convinced that they had neutralized their only problem. I finished my club soda and set the empty glass down on a nearby cocktail table. I did not feel angry anymore. The burning resentment that had choked me for the last 20 years had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical anticipation. Thomas was right about one thing. He was about to set a new industry standard. But it was not going to be for logistics or profit margins. It was going to be a cautionary tale taught in corporate compliance seminars for the next decade. I kept my eyes fixed on Thomas as he laughed loudly at a joke one of the investors made. "Enjoy the scotch, Thomas," I thought to myself. "Enjoy the expensive suit and the admiration of your peers. Enjoy every single second of this cocktail hour. Because the music is about to stop, and the man who owns the building is about to lock the doors." Right on cue, I saw the crowd part slightly near the center of the room. Richard was walking across the foyer, moving with that quiet, terrifying authority. He was not heading toward Thomas and the circle of investors. He was heading straight toward me. Richard navigated through the sea of expensive gowns and tailored tuxedos with the effortless glide of a man who owned every room he walked into. He did not make a direct, aggressive beeline toward me. He stopped briefly to accept a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. He offered a polite nod to a distant relative. He made his approach look entirely casual, just the groom's father stepping away from the loud music to find a quiet corner. But when he finally stopped beside my marble pillar, the temperature in my immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. He stood shoulder to shoulder with me, facing outward toward the ballroom. To anyone watching, we were just two members of the bridal party taking a quiet breather. But his jaw was locked tight, and the muscles in his neck were completely rigid. "Are the encrypted files you sent my legal team this morning fully verified?" Richard asked. His voice was low, smooth, and dangerously calm. It was the voice of a man accustomed to dismantling corporations before breakfast. I took a slow breath, keeping my eyes fixed on my mother, who was laughing obnoxiously on the other side of the room. Down to the last forged catering receipt, I replied. Richard took a measured sip of his sparkling water. I spent the last 3 hours reviewing the executive summary your firm provided, he said quietly. His eyes tracked Thomas across the room. Thomas was currently clapping a venture capitalist on the back, completely oblivious to the predator standing in the shadows. Your stepdad is a very bold man, Claire. He is trying to use my capital to plug a $30 million hole in his own sinking ship. He genuinely thought my team would not look past the surface-level audits he provided. He thought he was dealing with standard corporate accountants, I said, leaning slightly closer so my voice would not carry over the string quartet. He did not realize his lead forensic auditor was the stepdaughter he has been treating like garbage for 20 years. I gave your legal team everything, Richard. The offshore shell companies registered in Delaware, the phantom vendor invoices, the wire transfers funding this exact wedding, and the $5,000 florist bill he forced me to pay yesterday, which perfectly links his personal banking routing numbers to the embezzled funds. Richard turned his head slightly, finally looking directly at my face. The sheer intensity in his dark eyes was staggering. You did not just find the fraud, Claire. You meticulously mapped the entire DNA of his criminal enterprise and handed me the exact weapon to destroy him. You understand that when my legal team files these documents with the SEC on Monday, Thomas will face decades in federal prison. I met his gaze without flinching. I understand perfectly. And your mother, Richard, pressed, testing my resolve. Her signature is on the fraudulent commercial loan applications. She is legally bound to the conspiracy. She will lose the house, the cars, the accounts. She will be completely ruined. She made her choices, I said coldly. She signed those papers to fund a lifestyle built on lies. She chose to enable a thief because she liked the zip code. I am not protecting them anymore. A flicker of profound respect crossed Richard's face. In his world, loyalty was paramount, but competence and an unwavering commitment to the truth were priceless. He had watched my family humiliate me in the lobby. He had watched them exclude me from the photographs. Now he was watching me pull the trigger on their absolute destruction. Jamal does not know yet. Richard said, his voice softening just a fraction when he mentioned his son. He loves that girl. He believes the fantasy she sold him. This is going to break his heart. It is better his heart breaks today than 10 years from now when the FBI kicks his door down because his wife tied his medical practice to a money laundering scheme. I replied honestly. Jamal is a good man. He deserves the truth. But I could not tell him. He would not have believed me. He needed to see it from you. Richard nodded slowly in agreement. He looked back out at the crowd. Brittany was currently twirling on the dance floor in her stolen Vera Wang dress, laughing loudly with her friends. Jamal was watching her with absolute adoration. The tragedy of what was about to happen to his son clearly weighed heavily on Richard, but he was a man of logic and preservation. He would not allow a toxic parasite to attach itself to his family tree. The federal agents, Richard asked, shifting back to business. They are standing by in the area, I confirmed. I gave the lead investigator the final signal 20 minutes ago. The arrest warrants were signed by a federal judge this morning, based on the evidence I provided. As soon as the reception is over, they are going to walk through the front doors of this hotel and put Thomas in handcuffs. Richard looked down at his heavy gold watch. It was a custom timepiece, elegant and precise. The cocktail hour concludes in 10 minutes. We are moving into the main ballroom for dinner and the toasts. Thomas has asked me to give a speech right after Brittany does her welcome toast. He expects me to publicly bless the upcoming corporate merger in front of all his investors. He wants you to write the check right in front of his audience, I noted. Richard let out a dark, humorless chuckle. Oh, I am going to give a speech, all right. I am going to give him exactly the public recognition he deserves. The grand double doors leading into the main reception hall slowly swung open. The hotel staff began walking through the crowd, politely chiming small silver bells to signal that it was time for the guests to take their seats for dinner. The loud chatter in the room began to shift toward the doors. Richard buttoned his suit jacket, his posture straightening into that of a commanding general preparing to walk onto a battlefield. He turned to me one last time before joining the crowd. "I have dealt with hundreds of corporate executives, billionaires, and ruthless businessmen in my career," Claire Richard said quietly. "But I have never met anyone who plays the long game quite as flawlessly as you do. When the dust settles on this weekend, you should call my office. I could use someone with your specific set of skills on my executive board." "I will keep that in mind, Richard," I said, allowing a small genuine smile to touch my lips. He gave me a single, decisive nod, then turned and walked away, blending seamlessly back into the moving crowd. I watched him approach Jamal and put a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. The trap was fully armed. The explosives were wired. All I had to do now was walk into that beautiful ballroom, find my assigned seat, and wait for the show to begin. I followed the crowd of guests through the towering mahogany doors and into the main reception hall. Thomas had spared absolutely no expense, or rather, he had spared none of his investors' capital. The ballroom was transformed into an opulent wonderland. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over dozens of round tables draped in heavy white silk. Towering centerpieces of white roses and imported orchids sat in the middle of every table, the very same flowers Thomas had forced me to pay for just 24 hours earlier. I walked past the head table, a massive sprawling arrangement decorated with cascading greenery and floating candles, and found my assigned seat. My mother had placed me at a table near the front, but entirely separated from the immediate family. I was seated with a group of distant cousins and some of Thomas's lower-level corporate managers. It was a calculated placement. I was close enough to the stage to be perfectly visible for the impending humiliation, but far enough away from the bridal party to ensure everyone knew my actual rank in the family hierarchy. I sat down and placed my clutch on my lap. Waiters immediately began pouring expensive champagne and serving the first course of lobster bisque. The room buzzed with the loud, cheerful energy of 200 people completely intoxicated by the display of wealth. I looked over at the sweetheart table set up on a small elevated stage at the front of the room. Brittany and Jamal sat side by side. Jamal looked incredibly happy, laughing and whispering into his new bride's ear. Brittany smiled brilliantly, her vintage pearls glowing under the stage lights. To his right, Thomas and Diane sat at a prominent VIP table with Richard and Jamal's mother Sylvia. Thomas was completely relaxed, his face flushed with triumph. He had successfully navigated the ceremony and the cocktail hour. He truly believed he had pulled off the ultimate con. The dinner service proceeded flawlessly. I ate my meal in quiet observation, offering polite, brief responses to the corporate managers at my table, who asked mundane questions about my flight from Chicago. My mind was not on the food. My mind was on the parking lot outside. I knew that somewhere in the dark perimeter of the hotel grounds, black federal vehicles were quietly pulling into designated spots. I knew agents were reviewing the unredacted ledgers I had provided. The invisible noose was tightening around Thomas's neck with every passing minute, and he was completely oblivious. As the waiters began clearing the dinner plates to make way for the wedding cake, the string quartet faded out. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, and a bright spotlight illuminated the sweetheart table. The room grew quiet, anticipating the traditional speeches. The best man went first, delivering a short, genuinely touching speech about Jamal's dedication as a surgeon and his loyalty as a friend. Jamal wiped a small tear from his eye, and the crowd applauded warmly. Then the wedding planner approached the stage and handed the microphone to Brittany. Normally, the father of the bride or the groom would speak next, but Brittany never missed an opportunity to command an audience. She stood up, the heavy silk of her custom Vera Wang gown shimmering under the spotlight. She tapped the microphone with a manicured finger, ensuring she had the absolute attention of every single person in the room. She began her speech with sickening sweetness. She thanked Jamal for being her Prince Charming. She thanked Richard and Sylvia for welcoming her into their prestigious family. She looked over at Thomas and Diane, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured emotion as she thanked her daddy for giving her the fairy tale wedding of her dreams. Thomas beamed, raising his glass of expensive scotch in a proud salute. But then Brittany's posture shifted. The sweet, emotional bride persona vanished, replaced by the cruel, calculated mean girl I had known for 20 years. She turned her body slightly, directing her gaze right past the floral centerpieces, locking her eyes directly onto me. Now I cannot forget to mention my older stepsister Claire Brittany announced, her voice echoing loudly through the ballroom speakers. The spotlight operator, clearly following prearranged instructions, swung a secondary beam of light directly onto my table. Suddenly I was illuminated for all 200 guests to see. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my face completely devoid of emotion. Brittany let out a theatrical sigh, leaning into the microphone. I have to give Claire a lot of credit for showing up tonight. It must be so incredibly hard for her to be here. I mean, here I am marrying the man of my dreams at 29, and poor Claire is still single at 35. A low ripple of uncomfortable laughter washed through the room. Some guests shifted in their seats, unsure if this was acceptable sibling banter or a genuine insult. But my mother, Diane, immediately let out a loud, encouraging laugh, covering her mouth with her hand, as if Brittany had just delivered a brilliant comedic punchline. Taking their cue from the mother of the bride, the rest of the room joined in. Brittany smirked, energized by the audience reaction. She stepped down from the elevated stage, dragging the microphone cord behind her as she slowly began walking toward my table. We honestly tried to help her find a date for tonight, Brittany continued, her tone mocking and completely devoid of empathy. But it is just so hard to find a guy who wants to ride shotgun in a tragic decade-old Honda. The laughter grew louder. The corporate managers sitting at my table looked at me sideways, chuckling awkwardly. I kept my eyes locked on Brittany as she strutted closer. She was playing the sassy, unfiltered bride, a persona that reality television had normalized, and wealthy crowds seemed to adore. She was turning my entire existence into a punchline to elevate her own status. And she just works so hard, Brittany said, feigning sympathy, as she stopped a few feet away from my chair. She sits in a cubicle all day, crunching numbers, completely isolated from the real world. She is so dedicated to her little accounting job that she barely has time to furnish her apartment, which, by the way, is the exact size of my new walk-in closet. The ballroom erupted into full laughter now. Brittany had perfectly orchestrated the moment. She had taken every vulnerability, every supposed flaw, and broadcast it to a room full of millionaires. She painted me as a pathetic, poor, lonely spinster who was completely beneath the elegant family she was marrying into. I looked past Brittany's shoulder. I saw Thomas sitting at the VIP table, nodding his head in agreement, a wide, arrogant smile plastered across his face. He was thoroughly enjoying my public execution. He felt completely safe knowing his stepdaughter was being humiliated into silence. I looked at Jamal. His smile had completely vanished. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Brittany and me. He was finally starting to see the vicious reality of the woman he had just vowed to spend his life with. But once again he remained seated. He did not grab the microphone. He did not stop her. Brittany took the final few steps, stopping right beside my chair. The heavy silk of her stolen dress brushed against my arm. She looked down at me, her eyes filled with absolute malice and triumphant superiority. She had the entire room eating out of the palm of her hand. She had successfully turned my life into a joke. She thought she had utterly destroyed me. She thought she had won the ultimate victory. She had no idea that I was just waiting for her to finish digging her own grave. Brittany leaned down, her face hovering mere inches from mine. The harsh glare of the overhead spotlight caught the edge of the vintage pearl necklace she had stolen from me that morning, making the delicate gems glow brightly against her skin. She smelled heavily of expensive champagne and an overpowering custom floral perfume. She held the microphone tight in her left hand, ensuring her voice would continue to boom from every speaker mounted on the ballroom walls. "I know things have been really tight for you lately, Claire," Brittany said, her voice dripping with a sickening manufactured pity. "It must be so difficult watching everyone else move forward while you are stuck exactly where you have always been. But we are family, and family takes care of each other." The sprawling ballroom was dead silent now. The initial laughter had died down, replaced by a tense collective breath, as 200 wealthy guests waited to see what the radiant bride would do next. Brittany shifted her weight, the heavy layers of her custom silk dress rustling loudly in the quiet room. With her free hand, she reached into the small diamond-encrusted designer clutch tucked under her arm. I knew exactly how much that specific clutch cost, because I had seen the forged vendor invoice used to pay for it just 3 weeks ago. She dug her manicured fingers inside the silk lining and pulled out a crisp, green $100 bill. She held the money up near her face so the spotlight would catch it, making absolutely sure the entire room saw exactly what she was holding. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she crumpled the crisp bill into a tight, uneven ball. She extended her arm over my shoulder and dropped the crumpled money directly onto my empty white porcelain bread plate. The green paper hit the fine china with a soft, insulting scratch. "Buy yourself a decent dress next time," Claire Brittany announced, her tone abruptly shifting from fake pity to cold, vicious condescension. "You look completely tragic, and you are embarrassing Jamal and his entire family." A collective gasp rippled through the back half of the room, followed immediately by scattered nervous giggles from Brittany's bridesmaids seated near the front. It was the ultimate public execution. She had not just insulted my appearance or mocked my career. She had successfully reduced me to a pathetic beggar at her lavish banquet, throwing financial scraps at my plate for the pure entertainment of her high society audience. She pulled the microphone away from her face, offered me one final triumphant smirk, and turned her back on me. She strutted back toward the elevated sweetheart table, the heavy microphone cord dragging behind her. The crowd practically parted for her as if she were royalty returning to her throne. I sat perfectly still in the harsh, blinding beam of the spotlight. I did not reach for the money. I did not stand up and scream. I did not run out of the ballroom in tears. I simply looked down at the crumpled bill resting on the pristine white plate. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. In that suspended moment of absolute humiliation, the entire world seemed to slow down into sharp, hyper-focused clarity. I lifted my chin and began to slowly pan my gaze across the crowded room, looking directly at the people who had just watched my public crucifixion. I looked at the corporate managers seated at my own table. They immediately averted their eyes, staring down at their linen napkins, or suddenly finding their crystal water glasses incredibly fascinating. They were cowards. They knew what they had just witnessed was incredibly cruel, but their paychecks depended entirely on Thomas. So they remained completely silent, complicit in their cowardly inaction. I shifted my gaze to the VIP table on the right side of the stage. My mother Diane was sitting with her legs crossed, a serene, highly amused expression resting on her flawless face. She raised her crystal champagne flute to her lips, taking a slow, elegant sip, entirely unbothered by the fact that her eldest daughter had just been degraded in front of hundreds of strangers. She did not see a victim sitting across the room. She only saw a successful, dominant performance by her golden child. Next to her, my stepdad Thomas was leaning back in his plush velvet chair. He was openly smiling. He caught my eye across the vast distance and gave me a barely perceptible nod of pure, arrogant satisfaction. In his mind, this was the absolute perfect victory. He had bullied me into submission in the hotel hallway. He had successfully pitched his fraudulent company to the venture capitalists during cocktail hour, and now his daughter had publicly put me in my place. He believed he was completely untouchable. He believed his stolen money had made him a god. I let my eyes wander to the extended family members scattered throughout the room. Some of my cousins were whispering behind their hands. Others were openly laughing, eager to align themselves with the wealth and power radiating from the bridal party. Nobody stood up, nobody objected, nobody said a single word in my defense. This was the toxic ecosystem I had grown up in. This was the family that had demanded my absolute loyalty, while systematically destroying my self-worth for 2 decades. They had isolated me, mocked me, and stolen from me, all while demanding that I smile and play the part of the grateful, quiet stepdaughter. But as I looked around the opulent ballroom surrounded by the extravagant floral centerpieces I had paid for, and the massive crystal chandeliers funded entirely by federal crimes, the last remaining thread of my familial obligation completely snapped. I did not feel humiliated anymore. The sharp sting of Brittany's words evaporated into the cool, air-conditioned air of the reception hall. The $100 bill sitting on my plate was not an insult. To my trained analytical mind, it was just a physical manifestation of their absolute ignorance. It was a piece of paper drawn directly from an offshore account that federal agents were currently freezing. They thought this was the climax of the evening. They thought they had written the final chapter of my story, casting me as the pathetic loser who would quietly fade into the background while they celebrated their stolen wealth. I looked over at the sweetheart table. Jamal was staring blankly at the floor, his hands gripped tightly into rigid fists on his lap. He looked physically sick to his stomach, the horrifying reality of his new wife finally crashing down around him. Beside him, Brittany was settling back into her chair, laughing brightly, as one of her bridesmaids leaned over to compliment her savage speech. And then, I looked past the elevated stage toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. I knew exactly what was waiting just on the other side of those thick walls. I knew the federal warrants were already signed. I knew the unredacted digital ledgers were already sitting on a prosecutor's desk in downtown Chicago. I reached out my fingers, brushing against the rough texture of the crumpled $100 bill. I did not put it in my purse. I picked it up, smoothed out the deep creases with my thumbs, and folded it neatly in half. I placed it quietly next to my water glass. I was going to need that bill later. I was going to use it to buy Brittany a cup of cheap black coffee when the federal agents seized every single asset she owned and locked her out of her hotel suite. The spotlight operator finally clicked off the beam, aimed at my table, plunging me back into the comfortable, anonymous shadows of the room. The string quartet began to play a soft classical melody, signaling the start of the dessert service. The guests slowly resumed their loud chatter, eager to move past the awkward tension and get back to the open bar. I sat back in my chair, my posture absolutely perfect, my expression entirely unreadable. The public humiliation was over. The stage was officially set. It was finally time for the groom's father to speak. The spotlight operator had finally clicked off the beam aimed at my table, but the heavy, suffocating tension in the room remained. The scattered laughter from the guests began to die down, replaced by the awkward clinking of silverware against china. Brittany had successfully delivered her punchline, but the lingering aftermath was starting to sour. People were beginning to realize that what they had just witnessed was not a playful sibling rivalry. It was an act of pure, unadulterated cruelty. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the sweetheart table. Brittany was practically glowing, completely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. She leaned back in her chair, casually adjusting the stolen vintage pearls around her neck, waiting for her new husband to validate her performance. But Jamal was not smiling. I watched him carefully, analyzing his body language the exact same way I would analyze a fraudulent spreadsheet. For the past 2 years, Jamal had been completely blinded by a carefully constructed illusion. Brittany had played the role of the sweet, charitable, loving partner flawlessly. She had mirrored his kindness, hiding her toxic nature behind a mask of perfection. Jamal had bought into the fantasy because he was a genuinely good man who wanted to believe the best in people. But that mask had just slipped, and it had slipped in front of 200 people. Jamal stared across the ballroom, his eyes locked onto the crumpled $100 bill sitting next to my water glass. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. The cognitive dissonance was breaking him apart in real time. He looked at the money. Then he looked at me, sitting alone in the shadows, and finally, he slowly turned his head to look at the woman sitting beside him. Brittany caught him looking and flashed him a radiant, completely oblivious smile. "Did you like my speech, babe?" she mouthed to him, reaching out to place her manicured hand over his. Jamal flinched. He physically recoiled from her touch, as if she had just pressed a hot branding iron against his skin. His handsome face, usually so warm and inviting, twisted into an expression of absolute horror and disgust. The reality of what he had just tied his life to was finally crashing down on him. He had not married a sweet, loving woman. He had married a bully, a narcissist, a woman who found genuine joy in humiliating her own family members. He looked down at his own hands, which were now trembling slightly. He clenched them into tight fists. He was a highly respected orthopedic surgeon. He dedicated his entire life to healing people, to fixing broken things. And he had just pledged his eternal loyalty to a woman whose only instinct was to tear people apart for sport. Jamal could not take it anymore. The silence of complicity he had maintained during the photo session earlier that afternoon had finally expired. He threw his white linen napkin onto the table with a sudden violent motion. The heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the polished marble floor as he pushed himself backward. He stood up abruptly. His chest was heaving, his jaw locked in a tight, angry line. He did not care about the optics anymore. He did not care about causing a scene at his own wedding reception. He took a deliberate step toward Brittany, his hand reaching out. He was going to take the microphone right out of her grasp. He was going to apologize to me in front of the entire room and demand that his new wife do the same. But he never reached the microphone. Before Jamal could take a second step, a tall, commanding figure materialized right beside the sweetheart table. It was Richard. Richard had been sitting at the VIP table silently observing the entire horrific display. He had watched Thomas laugh at my expense. He had watched my mother beam with pride. And most importantly, he had watched his own son's heart break. Richard knew exactly what Jamal was about to do. Jamal was acting on raw, chaotic emotion. He wanted to fix the immediate injustice. But Richard was a venture capitalist, a corporate titan who operated on pure, calculated strategy. He knew that an emotional outburst from Jamal would only create a messy domestic dispute. Richard was not there to mediate a family argument. He was there to execute a financial and criminal takedown. Richard moved with terrifying speed and precision. He stepped directly between Jamal and Brittany, completely blocking his son's path. Richard placed a firm, heavy hand flat against Jamal's chest, stopping him dead in his tracks. Jamal looked up at his father, his eyes wide with confusion and betrayal. "Dad." Jamal whispered, his voice thick with suppressed anger. "Do not stop me. You saw what she just did. You saw what they are. I have to say something. I have to stop this." Richard did not move his hand. He looked at his son, his dark eyes radiating a mixture of deep paternal sympathy and absolute unyielding authority. "I know exactly what they are." "Jamal," Richard replied, his voice so low that only Jamal and Brittany could hear it. "I see them. But you need to sit down. You are too angry to handle this correctly. Let me handle it." Jamal hesitated, his muscles still tense and ready to fight. But the commanding presence of his father was impossible to ignore. Richard had always protected his family with a ruthless efficiency. Jamal swallowed hard, gave Brittany one last look of pure disgust, and slowly lowered himself back into his chair. With Jamal neutralized, Richard turned his attention to the rest of the room. He did not rush. He smoothed the front of his tailored suit jacket and slowly turned to face the 200 guests. His face was like carved stone, entirely devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. The effect was instantaneous. The low murmur of conversation that had started to rebuild completely died away. The string quartet, sensing the massive shift in the rooms, Energy awkwardly stopped playing mid-measure. The silence that fell over the ballroom was not just quiet. It was heavy. It was suffocating. It was the kind of absolute silence that precedes a massive catastrophic storm. At the VIP table, Thomas noticed Richard standing up and completely misinterpreted the situation. Thomas thought the moment had finally arrived. He thought Richard was stepping up to deliver the highly anticipated speech blessing their upcoming corporate merger. Thomas sat up straight, practically vibrating with greedy excitement. He smiled widely, raising his glass of expensive scotch in the air toward Richard, ready to accept the praise and the millions of dollars he believed were coming his way. My mother Diane mirrored her husband's excitement, clapping her hands together softly and leaning forward with an expectant, greedy smile. They were completely oblivious to the fact that they were staring directly at their own executioner. Richard ignored Thomas's raised glass. He did not smile back. He did not acknowledge my mother. He simply stood perfectly still in the center of the elevated stage, letting the silence stretch out until it became physically uncomfortable for everyone in the room. He let the tension build until the guests were practically holding their breath. He looked out across the sea of expensive dresses and tailored tuxedos. He looked at the massive floral centerpieces and the crystal chandeliers. And finally, his piercing gaze swept across the room and locked directly onto me. I was sitting alone in the shadows, my posture perfectly straight, the crumpled $100 bill resting on the plate in front of me. I held his gaze. We were the only two people in the entire building who knew exactly what was about to happen. The match had been struck, the fuel had been poured, and Richard was holding the microphone. He reached out and took the microphone from the stand in front of Brittany. He did not look at her. He just held the cold metal in his hand, preparing to burn Thomas's entire fraudulent empire completely to the ground. Richard tapped the metal grate of the microphone once with his index finger. A short, sharp burst of feedback echoed through the massive ballroom, cutting through the heavy silence like a physical blow. Every single pair of eyes in the room was completely locked onto him. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at his son. He kept his dark, piercing gaze fixed entirely on the bride sitting just a few feet away from him. Brittany was still holding on to the remnants of her arrogant smirk. Her brain had not quite processed the shift in the atmosphere. She shifted slightly in her chair, the layers of her custom silk gown rustling softly, and looked up at her new father-in-law with a mixture of confusion and expectant greed. She likely thought Richard was about to formally welcome her into his elite family, or perhaps announce a massive financial wedding gift. Brittany, Richard began. His voice did not boom, it did not need to. It was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the acoustics of the room effortlessly. It was the voice of a man who was used to giving orders that dismantled entire corporations. You just spent 5 minutes standing on this stage mocking Claire's bank account. Richard said, his tone dropping to an icy, terrifying register. You made a very public spectacle of her financial situation. I find that deeply ironic. Brittany blinked her perfectly applied makeup, unable to hide the sudden falter in her expression. Her smile finally cracked the corners of her mouth, twitching downward. She looked quickly over at Thomas, seeking reassurance, but Thomas was gripping the edge of the VIP table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. I find it ironic, Richard continued, his voice projecting flawlessly through the dozens of speakers mounted around the opulent reception hall. Considering that every single cent that paid for this wedding, this luxury hotel, and that designer dress you are currently wearing was stolen directly from my company. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The words hung in the air, dense and heavy, completely suffocating the room. And then the dam broke. A collective, audible gasp erupted from the 200 guests. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated shock that rippled from the front tables all the way to the back of the room. A woman, seated near the center aisle, actually dropped her silver dinner fork, the sharp clatter ringing out against her porcelain plate. Whispers immediately ignited, spreading like wildfire through the ranks of the venture capitalists, the corporate attorneys, and the high society socialites. Brittany physically recoiled as if Richard had reached out and slapped her across the face. Her jaw dropped open, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She looked down at her hands, then down at the glittering white silk of her dress, suddenly realizing that she was draped head to toe in federal evidence. The untouchable radiant bride persona shattered into a million irreparable pieces in the span of 10 seconds. Jamal stared at his father, his chest heaving. The final piece of the puzzle had just violently snapped into place for him. He looked at Brittany, his face contorting with a mixture of betrayal and profound disgust. He finally understood why his father had stopped him from taking the microphone. This was not a family dispute. This was a crime scene. At the VIP table, the blood completely drained from Thomas's face. He turned a sickening shade of ash white. The arrogant, untouchable CEO who had been boasting to billionaires just an hour ago was suddenly gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. He looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically, as he realized that the men he had been trying to impress were now staring at him with cold, calculating disgust. Thomas scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He forced a wide, incredibly unnatural laugh, holding his hands up toward the crowd, as if he were trying to physically push the accusations away. "Richard, my friend," Thomas shouted, his voice cracking slightly with panic. "That is a hell of a dark joke. You really had us going there for a second." He looked around the room, desperately trying to rally the crowd to his side. "A little venture capitalist humor, folks," Thomas declared loudly, his face shining with cold sweat. "Richard is just keeping us on our toes before we finalize the big merger." Give the man a round of applause. Nobody clapped. Nobody even breathed. The venture capitalists sitting nearby did not smile. They were already reaching into their tuxedo jackets, pulling out their smartphones to text their respective legal teams. They smelled blood in the water. Richard did not even blink at Thomas's pathetic attempt to gaslight the entire ballroom. He reached his free hand into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and slowly pulled out a thick, meticulously folded stack of papers. It was the executive summary of the unredacted digital ledgers I had uploaded to his legal team that morning. "There is no merger," Thomas Richard said, his voice slicing right through Thomas's frantic laughter. "There is only an acquisition of a bankrupt, hollowed-out shell and a federal indictment with your name written all over it." Richard unfolded the documents, flattening them against the top of the sweetheart table. He did not need to read the numbers, he already had them memorized, but the visual impact of the audited papers was devastating. "You thought you could use my capital to plug the massive holes in your balance sheets," Richard announced, addressing Thomas directly, but keeping the microphone close so the entire room heard every brutal detail. "You set up 3 offshore shell companies registered to a post office box in Delaware. You generated phantom vendor invoices for services that never existed, approved them yourself, and funneled the cash straight into your personal accounts." Thomas opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to shout something, but no words came out. He just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Let us talk about transparency," Thomas Richard continued, mercilessly throwing Thomas's own cocktail hour boasts right back in his face. "Let us talk about the $45,000 you wired from a phantom logistics vendor directly to the bridal boutique in New York to pay for that gown. Let us talk about the $120,000 you stole from your own employee's pension fund to secure this ballroom tonight." "Stop it!" Brittany shrieked, her voice shrill and hysterical. She slapped her hands over her ears, tears of humiliation ruining her perfect makeup. "Daddy, tell him to stop." But Thomas could not save her. He could not even save himself. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting his chair. Richard shifted his dark, unyielding gaze from Thomas to the woman sitting frozen next to him. My mother, Diane, was entirely paralyzed. She had shrunk down into her seat, trying to make herself as small as possible, her silver evening gown suddenly looking like a prison uniform. "And Diane," Richard said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming even more lethal, "do not sit there and pretend you are just the naive, grieving housewife who knew nothing about where the money came from." My mother gasped, bringing a trembling hand up to her mouth. She shook her head frantically, tears welling in her eyes, instantly trying to deploy the victim routine that had worked for her entire life. My legal team has already reviewed the commercial loan applications you submitted 6 months ago, Richard stated, driving the final nail into their collective coffin. We have the documents. We have your signature on the guarantor line for a fraudulent $2.5 million loan using collateral that Thomas had already secretly liquidated. You signed those forged documents willingly. You are a named co-conspirator in a massive federal fraud case. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The polite high society facade of the reception completely disintegrated. Several guests at the back tables immediately stood up and began walking briskly toward the exit doors, desperate to distance themselves from a federal crime scene before the authorities arrived. The corporate managers seated at my table were staring at the stage with their jaws unhinged, realizing that their jobs, their company, and their entire livelihoods were completely gone. I sat in the shadows, my posture perfectly still, watching the destruction unfold. I looked at the crumpled $100 bill resting next to my water glass. Thomas and Diane had spent 20 years building a fortress of lies, using money and status to crush anyone who dared to challenge their narrative. They had isolated me, bullied me, and tried to strip me of every ounce of my dignity. But as I watched Thomas collapse completely into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, and as I watched my mother openly sobbing while the wealthy guests she had desperately tried to impress looked at her with pure disgust, I knew I had finally won. The fortress had not just fallen, it had been reduced to absolute ash. The ballroom was in a state of absolute pandemonium, but Richard was not finished. He stood tall on the elevated stage, a monolith of calm amidst the frantic panic he had just unleashed. He slowly turned his back on the VIP table, completely dismissing Thomas and my mother Diane as if they were already locked behind thick steel bars. He shifted his piercing gaze away from the criminals and looked directly at his son. Jamal. Richard said, his voice cutting effortlessly through the rising noise of the fleeing guests. Jamal lifted his head. His eyes were red, filled with a turbulent mixture of profound grief and boiling anger. He looked at his father, waiting for the final verdict. I am deeply sorry that you were dragged into this theater of thieves, Richard continued, speaking directly to his son, but ensuring the microphone broadcast every single syllable to the remaining crowd. But you will not bear the consequences of their crimes. I had my legal team draft the annulment papers 3 hours ago. They are waiting for your signature in the hotel executive lounge right now. This marriage is legally void. Brittany let out a strangled, desperate sob. The reality of losing her wealthy doctor husband, her newly minted elite social status, and her absolute financial safety net all at the exact same time was too much for her to bear. Jamal, baby, please. Brittany begged, her voice high-pitched and frantic. She reached across the sweetheart table, her manicured fingers desperately clawing at the sleeve of his custom tuxedo jacket. I did not know anything about the stolen money. I swear to you, I did not know. My dad handled absolutely everything. Jamal stood up abruptly, aggressively shoving her hand away. Do not ever touch me again, Jamal said, his voice vibrating with pure, unfiltered disgust. You stood on this stage 5 minutes ago and threw garbage at your own sister for your own sick entertainment. You showed me exactly who you are. You are exactly who your father is. A complete fraud. Richard placed a firm, supportive hand on his son's shoulder, silently validating Jamal's strength. Then Richard turned his attention back to the center of the room. He raised his free hand and pointed a single steady finger directly toward my table in the back shadows. The collective gaze of every remaining guest in the ballroom followed his gesture, instantly locking onto me. The corporate managers sitting at my table practically shrank away from my chair, their eyes wide with sudden terror, realizing they had been sitting next to the architect of their company's destruction the entire night. Brittany, Richard said, his voice dropping into a tone of absolute chilling finality. You spent a great deal of time tonight laughing at your stepsister. You mocked her apartment. You mocked her car. You confidently told a room full of millionaires that she was just a pathetic number cruncher sitting in a cubicle. Richard took a slow, deliberate step forward on the stage, closing the distance between himself and the trembling bride. What you and your arrogant father completely failed to realize is that Claire is not a low-level bookkeeper. She is a senior forensic auditor for one of the most ruthless financial investigation firms in the country. A new wave of stunned gasps echoed through the room. At the VIP table, Thomas stopped hyperventilating for a split second. He slowly lifted his head from his hands and stared at me across the massive room. His face twisted from panicked terror into a mask of absolute paralyzing disbelief. He suddenly realized that the quiet, submissive stepdaughter he had extorted for a $5,000 florist bill just 24 hours earlier was the exact person tracking his federal crimes. The sheer poetry of his own arrogance destroying him was finally dawning on his greedy mind. When my venture capital firm began looking into your father's logistics company, Richard explained, his voice ringing with absolute triumph, we hired Claire's firm to conduct the deep dive corporate audit. We did not know her relation to your family at the time. She could have easily recused herself due to the conflict of interest. But she did not. Richard paused, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of his words settle over the frantic bride. She took the assignment, Richard said. For 3 grueling months, Claire meticulously tracked every single stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every offshore shell company your father tried to hide. She is the one who found the dirty money that paid for your dress. She is the one who compiled the evidence against your mother. She is the one who handed the unredacted ledgers to the federal investigators this morning. And as of Monday morning, Richard announced delivering the ultimate inescapable death blow to their fake empire. Claire is the primary state witness for the federal prosecution. She is the one who is going to take the stand in a federal courtroom and send your father to prison for the next 20 years. Brittany stood completely frozen, her eyes wide and entirely vacant. Her brain simply could not process the magnitude of the catastrophic reversal. The sister she had bullied, tormented, and publicly humiliated for 2 decades was the exact person holding the blade to her throat. She had spent her entire life treating me like an insignificant peasant, only to discover I was the executioner standing over the guillotine. Her perfectly manicured fingers went completely limp. She lacked the physical strength to even hold her own hand up. The heavy metal microphone slipped from her grip. It fell through the air and hit the hard wooden floor of the stage with a massive, deafening crack that echoed through the entire silent ballroom. The sharp, high-pitched feedback squeal that followed sounded exactly like a dying animal taking its final breath. I did not move from my chair. I did not stand up to take a bow. I did not offer a victorious, gloating smirk. I just sat quietly in the dim light, my posture perfectly straight, looking directly into Brittany's terrified, mascara-stained eyes. The $100 bill she had thrown at me just minutes earlier still sat perfectly folded next to my crystal water glass. It rested there as the ultimate symbol of their fatal ignorance. It was the absolute cheapest price anyone had ever paid to permanently and completely destroy their own life. The sharp squeal of the dropped microphone was the exact catalyst the room needed to finally shatter. The paralyzing shock that had held the 200 guests captive instantly evaporated, replaced by a frantic, chaotic scramble for the exits. The remaining venture capitalists abandoned their expensive cocktails and practically sprinted toward the coat check, barking furious orders into their cell phones as they mobilized their own legal teams to mitigate the fallout. At the VIP table, Thomas finally snapped out of his terrified trance. The absolute reality of his situation hit him with the force of a freight train. He looked at the furious faces of the investors he had just lied to. He looked at Richard standing like a judge on the stage, and then he looked at the grand mahogany doors at the far end of the ballroom. His survival instinct, honed by years of corporate deceit, kicked into overdrive. Thomas did not check on his sobbing wife. He did not look at his hysterical daughter. He abandoned his family without a single second of hesitation. He pushed himself away from the table so violently that his heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor. He turned and bolted toward the rear service doors, his expensive dress shoes slipping frantically against the polished marble. He pushed past a group of terrified waiters, his face completely pale, desperate to escape into the humid night air, before the walls closed in. He reached the heavy brass handles of the service exit and shoved the doors open with all his remaining strength. But Thomas did not find the empty alleyway he was hoping for. Standing immediately on the other side of the threshold, blocking his escape completely, was a solid wall of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers. The lead investigator, the exact man I had been texting just an hour prior, stepped forward into the bright light of the ballroom. He reached out, grabbed Thomas by the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo, and shoved him violently backward into the reception hall. Thomas stumbled and fell to his knees, his hands instinctively going up in surrender. 3 agents swarmed him instantly. The harsh metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around his wrists, echoed through the room, cutting through the ambient noise of the panicking crowd. Thomas, the lead investigator, said, his voice loud and devoid of any sympathy. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." My mother, Diane, witnessed her husband's brutal arrest from the VIP table. She let out a blood-curdling scream, burying her face in her hands as she collapsed over her untouched plate of lobster bisque. Her perfect silver evening gown was soaked in spilled champagne, her carefully curated high society image completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. On the elevated stage, Brittany was having a full-blown psychological meltdown. She dropped to her knees on the floorboards, tearing at the heavy silk fabric of her designer gown. She shrieked hysterically, a guttural sound of pure panic, demanding that someone fix this, demanding that her father do something, demanding that the hotel staff throw the federal agents out of her wedding. Her mascara ran down her face in thick black rivers, ruining her perfect bridal makeup. Jamal stood beside her, looking down at the woman he had almost tied his entire existence to. He did not reach out to comfort her. He did not try to calm her down. He just looked at her with an expression of profound, chilling emptiness. The illusion was dead. Jamal calmly raised his right hand and grasped the heavy gold wedding band resting on his left ring finger. With a smooth, deliberate motion, he pulled the ring off. He did not throw it at her. He simply leaned forward and placed the gold band gently onto the center of the white silk tablecloth. He turned around and walked down the steps of the stage. He walked right past the sobbing form of his former bride, right past my weeping mother, and right past the federal agents who were currently dragging Thomas toward the front lobby. He met his father, Richard, near the center of the room. Richard offered him a single proud nod. Without looking back a single time, Jamal and his family walked out of the ballroom, leaving the toxic wreckage of my family entirely behind them. I watched the crowd thin out until the ballroom was mostly empty, save for the federal agents securing the area and the hotel management frantically trying to contain the disaster. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I picked up the folded $100 bill resting next to my water glass. I walked across the vast, chaotic floor. My footsteps were calm and measured. I bypassed the VIP table, where my mother was now hyperventilating into a cloth napkin. I walked directly up the small set of wooden stairs to the sweetheart table. Brittany was still on her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands clutching the edges of the white tablecloth as if it were a life raft. She heard my footsteps and slowly looked up at me. Her eyes were red, swollen, and filled with a desperate, terrified pleading. She looked at me, expecting me to gloat, expecting me to scream at her the way she had screamed at me for my entire life. I did not say a single word. I reached out my hands, moving with absolute precision. I brushed her hair aside, found the small gold clasp of my late father's pearl necklace resting against the back of her neck, and unhooked it. I pulled the delicate string of vintage pearls away from her skin. They felt cool and familiar in my hands. I carefully draped them around my own neck, feeling the comforting weight of my father's memory settle back exactly where it belonged. Brittany watched me take them back, too broken and terrified to even attempt to stop me. Once the necklace was secure, I looked down at her tear-streaked face. I opened my right hand and let the tightly folded $100 bill drop. It fluttered through the air and landed perfectly in the center of her lap, resting against the ruined silk of her stolen wedding dress. Buy yourself a decent lawyer, Brittany, I said softly, my voice perfectly steady. You are going to need it. I turned my back on her for the last time. I walked down the stage steps and headed straight for the grand mahogany doors. I walked out of the Ritz Carlton, stepping out into the cool, refreshing night air of the city, leaving them to drown in the exact nightmare they had built for themselves. 6 months passed and the federal justice system moved with a swift, merciless efficiency. Thomas did not even attempt to take his case to a jury trial. The digital evidence I had provided to the federal investigators was absolutely ironclad. He knew that if he fought the charges, he would be facing over 20 years in a maximum security facility. So he took a plea deal. He stood in a federal courtroom stripped of his expensive designer suits and wearing a standard orange jumpsuit, and pleaded guilty to all counts of fraud and embezzlement. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. The immediate financial fallout was catastrophic for my mother and stepsister. The government moved aggressively to seize every single asset Thomas had acquired using the stolen funds in order to pay back Richard and the other defrauded investors. The massive brick colonial mansion was foreclosed on and auctioned off. The luxury imported cars were repossessed in the middle of the night. Their offshore bank accounts were completely frozen and drained. Because Diane had knowingly signed the fraudulent commercial loan applications, she was held civilly liable for the massive remaining debt. She was forced to declare total bankruptcy. Today, Diane and Brittany no longer live in the affluent suburbs. They share a cramped, dingy, one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. Brittany tried to leverage her social media following to launch a career as an influencer, but the massive public scandal surrounding her annulled wedding and her father's federal indictment completely destroyed her reputation. The high society friends who had eagerly attended her lavish wedding immediately blocked her number and severed all ties. She now works a minimum wage retail job, spending her days folding clothes in a discount outlet mall, drowning under a mountain of insurmountable legal debt. They got exactly the life they had always mocked me for, but without a fraction of the dignity or the work ethic required to survive it. My life, on the other hand, moved in an entirely different direction. Following the flawless execution of the logistics audit and my seamless cooperation with the federal authorities, my accounting firm held a massive executive meeting. They recognized the sheer level of skill, discretion, and raw analytical power it took to dismantle a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise from the inside. They did not just give me a bonus, they promoted me to a full partnership position. I moved out of my small apartment and bought a beautiful, spacious loft in the center of Chicago, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. I bought it with my own clean, hard-earned money. I did not need a wealthy husband or a corrupt stepdad to build my empire. I built it myself, one meticulously balanced spreadsheet at a time. It is a quiet Sunday evening, and I am currently pulling my car into the sprawling tree-lined driveway of an elegant estate just outside the city. The front door opens before I even reach the porch. Sylvia is standing there wearing a warm, genuine smile. She pulls me into a tight maternal hug, the kind of hug I had spent my entire childhood desperately wanting from my own mother, but never receiving. "Come on in, Claire," Sylvia says warmly. "Richard just opened that bottle of vintage wine you like, and Jamal is finishing up the steaks on the patio." I step inside the grand foyer. The house is filled with the rich smell of roasting garlic and the sound of easy, comfortable laughter. Jamal walks in from the back doors holding a pair of grilling tongs. He looks incredibly healthy. The heavy, suffocating stress that had shadowed him during his brief relationship with Brittany is completely gone. He smiles brightly when he sees me coming over to give me a quick hug. Richard walks out of the study holding 2 crystal wine glasses. He hands one to me, his dark eyes filled with absolute unwavering respect. He does not view me as a victim or a charity case. He views me as an equal. To the sharpest mind in Chicago, Richard toasts, raising his glass slightly. I smile, clinking my glass against his. To justice, I reply. I sit down at their massive dining table surrounded by people who value truth, loyalty, and character above all else. I had spent 35 years of my life believing that family was defined strictly by blood and legal documents. I thought I was obligated to tolerate the abuse, the manipulation, and the constant humiliation simply because we shared a last name. But sitting here now, I realize that true family is entirely a choice. It is a sanctuary built on mutual respect, not a prison built on toxic obligations. I had to burn my old life completely to the ground to realize that I was never the problem. I was never the broken one. I was just a mirror reflecting their own profound ugliness back at them, and they hated me for it. They tried to keep me quiet, because they knew that the moment I finally decided to speak, their entire fragile world would collapse. If you are watching this, and you are currently shrinking yourself to fit into a family that treats you like a burden, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe your loyalty to people who use you as a punching bag. You do not owe your silence to people who steal your peace. Walking away is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of supreme self-preservation. The hardest thing you will ever do is accept that the people who are supposed to love you the most are entirely incapable of doing so. But the most beautiful thing you will ever do is realize that their inability to love you has absolutely nothing to do with your actual worth. Build your own table. Find the people who celebrate your strength rather than fearing it. Stand your ground, gather your evidence, and never let anyone convince you that you are small. Thank you for listening to my story today. Stay strong, protect your peace, and never mistake a woman's silence for weakness.